I've made it no secret that I really like visual novels, and one of the reasons I like them is because of how often they have fun, exciting characters. I'm a sucker for character-driven storytelling, and visual novels have that in spades. I've also in the past given pretty strong praise to developer Love and Space, who have released games, visual novels, and hybrids. Well, Love and Space is pretty much held together by a guy named Sam Yang. He's the director, writer, and he also does some of the art and animation work. I think he's a pretty talented writer, maybe not the best in the world, but still consistently good. One thing about him that sticks out to me is that he always has an interesting perspective on the stories he writes. He tackles his themes and ideas in a way that makes him stand out among the crowd. Shining Song Star Nova is, I think, his best work in terms of writing, and more so than his other stuff, really shows how he likes to turn things on their head. So today I'd like to take a deep look at Shining Song Star Nova with a focus on its characters. In particular, there's a lot of expectation subversion and interesting perspectives on common anime tropes and cliches. See, anime in particular tends to rely pretty heavily on specific character archetypes to the point where the characters often embody a certain set of traits in order to fit a predetermined mold. Shining Song Star Nova takes a lot of these character archetypes and does some interesting things with them. There's really a lot going on here, and I can't wait to talk about it. And I think it goes without saying that there will be spoilers. I definitely recommend reading through the visual novel yourself, and I will be spoiling pretty much everything. So first things first, I'd like to set the stage a bit for what Shining Song Star Nova is and how it's structured. It's set in modern day Japan and is about a producer managing a group of either failed or otherwise non-standard idols. Idols are these highly manufactured singing, dancing J-pop groups. The closest example here in the West would be if you remember the craze around certain boy bands like NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, or the more recent One Direction. Take that manufactured spectacle and expand it into an entire industry with its own subculture, and you have an idea of what it's like. Actually, a good example is probably K-pop, which has been growing in popularity here in the West. They have a very similar industry with actually a lot of the same positives and negatives as the Japanese idol industry. Now, let me make something perfectly clear. You don't have to care about idols or J-pop to enjoy and engage with Shining Song Star Nova. Even though it's one of my favorite visual novels, I don't engage with idol culture at all. The only idols I can say I'm actually a fan of are Baby Metal, and they aren't exactly the typical image of an idol group. Shining Song Star Nova deals with this group of aspiring idols trying to make it big, but rather than the mega wholesome kind of thing you'd see in an idol anime, it has much more of a focus on the gritty realities of the industry. Think of it like Hollywood. The average person thinks of movies as glamorous, exciting, with fame and fortune following those who are talented and willing to work hard, when in reality, there's a lot of shady shit that goes down. Behind the scenes deals can make or break an actor beyond their control. Sometimes an actor just loses public interest for no reason whatsoever. And there are also plenty of executives who use their positions of power to prey on young talent by promising to further their career if they go along with it or to destroy it if they resist. And even aside from all that, there are so many people who want to make it in film, but not enough roles to fill that demand. So someone can do everything right and still fail despite putting everything on the line. And the idol industry is the same way in many regards, which Shining Song Star Nova does not shy away from. Shining Song Star Nova follows a fairly standard dynamic story structure. There's a common route which introduces the story, setting, and of course, our lovely cast of characters. From there, it splits into 7 different complete stories, each focusing on one of the girls. Each girl's story is kicked off by the producer, who, by the way, is literally referred to as Mr. Producer or Producer-san most of the time, choosing them as the center or face of the unit. At that point, it's mostly a straight path toward the end, though each route does have one decision that can lead to a non-canon bad ending. So the way I'm going to do this is I want to focus on each of the characters, and I think the best way to do that is to go route by route. I'm not going to go over every single plot point in every single route, and I'll even be skipping over entire subplots because I really want to focus more on the characters and the overall themes rather than completely breaking everything down. Each of the 7 main heroines plays on certain anime character archetypes. Sometimes these are more concrete character tropes, but often it's more along the lines of certain characteristics you might see in an anime or another visual novel. But almost always, there's something resting just a bit deeper. Maria is introduced as a jaded wreck. She has the demeanor of a middle-aged guy stuck in a dead-end job wishing he had pursued his dreams. She was at one point a member of the major idol group Quasar, though she was eventually kicked out in a rather unpleasant way that I'll get into later. Ultimately, she goes through the best years of her life never really achieving her goals before everything she built was pulled out from under her. And now she's starting to get old and really doesn't see herself ever being able to truly make it. Okay, I say she's getting old, but she's 25. That's not much older than me, but for an idol who often start out in their early to mid-teens and peak in their early 20s, that's pretty close to the end point. She also becomes an alcoholic and starts smoking pretty heavily. If you were to sum up the major overarching point of the entire visual novel, which would be hard to do seeing as each route has its own themes to explore, two things would probably come to mind. The first is expectation and trope subversion. A lot of what you think would happen either doesn't happen or has some sort of twist. The second thing is what I mentioned earlier, the brutal reality of the idol industry compared to the whimsical nature of idol anime. Maria's story really pushes hard on that latter theme. The industry has beaten her down and harmed her psyche, and she's starting to lose that battle between hope and despair. There are three main conflicts in Maria's route. The first is the more surface level one. Starnova has a rivalry going with Quasar, and everything is building up to a big confrontation at the Idol Grand Prix, which is a big competition where both groups are looking to secure the #1 spot. The second is the conflict within Maria between her desires, hopes, and dreams, and the gritty, brutal reality of despair she's lived. The last is an interpersonal conflict between Maria, the oldest member and center, and Aki, the youngest member who arguably has the most long-term potential. Each of these three conflicts plays into each other, and they each get their time in the spotlight. With Aki and Maria's conflict, there's already an immediate contrast there. Old versus new, past versus future, the youngest versus the oldest. Of course, it's only a difference of 7 years, but that's a lot for an idol. The reality of the situation is that Maria has a lot more time as an idol behind her than ahead of her, whereas Aki is young, approaching the prime of her career, and has both the talent and drive to push towards the top. Now, I'll talk about Aki in more depth later on, but one thing to know about her is that she's incredibly driven and competitive. She doesn't just want to succeed, she wants to be #1, and in her eyes, Maria is standing in the way of that. She constantly pushes to edge Maria out and to take her place upon her inevitable retirement. This is not out of malice, but rather just self-interest. It's important to note that despite this rivalry, there's still a degree of camaraderie, and neither would sabotage the group just to put one over on the other. That being said, Aki still wants that center position, and she pushes for it constantly, bad-mouthing Maria to the producer. Not anything too awful, and certainly no lies, but she's just pointing out what I already did earlier. Maria's time is almost up, and Aki is logically the best chance Starnova has to capitalize on their initial success. Now, Maria logically realizes that Aki is basically just being an opportunistic little shit and it's nothing personal, but she does get affected by her words. Despite her apparent rebound with cutting back on the drinking and smoking and being the center of a successful idol unit, she's still dealing with the trauma brought on by her earlier experiences and struggles heavily with self-doubt, and Aki's words really only serve to twist the knife of negativity. I'm of two minds with this little arc here. I think it's good, but it doesn't quite get the love it deserves. While I think Maria's route is overall very engaging, I do feel like it was trying to tell too many stories and they got a bit muddled. The Aki rivalry eventually gets resolved almost as a side effect of Maria's personal development and a resurgence of her self-confidence, which I'll talk about soon. Eventually, Aki just kind of agrees to a ceasefire for the sake of the unit and does go on to become the center after Maria's time ends, a peaceful transition of power if you will. All these plot points work independently, but I feel like a lot of time went into setting up the rivalry until it just took a massive step back for the story to focus on Maria's internal struggles and history with Quasar. Now that's a much more important story for Maria's development as a character, so I don't have a problem with that being the main focal point of the route, but my big issue is with the pacing of it all. Aki as a character is ultimately a good person, but she's still aggressive in her pursuit of greatness, and I feel like she kind of gave up the fight a little too easily. I feel like she'd need more prodding and self-reflection before she could really summon the maturity necessary to swallow her pride and let Maria have her moment. Again, it's not what happens that I have an issue with. In fact, every individual thing that happens is entirely within character. I just feel like the resolution there was a bit rushed. Now, the main focus of Maria's route is this arc that starts a little bit after the whole Aki thing kicks into gear. In fact, while the rivalry was played up as a major point of conflict at the start, I feel it serves more as the inciting incident for Maria's personal journey, as the distress she feels from Aki's words pushes her into a minor mental breakdown where her anxiety takes over, she freaks out over nothing, and in her emotionally vulnerable state, blows the producer. You know, normal shit. But for real, this was the result of a bunch of different emotions all boiling over at once. She had her self-doubt, she had that hurt from Aki's constant belittling, she had feelings and sexual tension with the producer, and she lost control. But afterwards, she kinda calms down and regains her head. You know how when you're sick, you can feel just awful. Then you throw up and you still feel pretty crappy, but better than before. Well, that's kind of where Maria was, which got her to the point where she was ready, with the help of a little liquid courage, to actually tell the producer about her time with Quasar, which is where things get interesting. As a young kid, Maria was a big fish in a small pond. She hit puberty before her peers, so she was a star athlete, popular with the boys, and had good looks alongside some decent singing and dancing talent. So she sought to join Quasar's highly competitive trainee program. Due to her experiences in being better than her peers, she also had an arrogance as well as a drive to win at all costs, which endeared her to Quasar's producer Kamijo, a rather ruthless businessman himself. Eventually, after a grueling training process, she landed a spot on the main roster of Quasar, at which point the rankings are determined entirely via fan elections, meaning results trump all. The whole foundation of Quasar is the notion that competition pushes the individual to excel, and when individuals push the limits of their potential, it benefits the group as a whole. This is in direct contrast to the environment that the producer tries to foster with Star Nova. Of course, he still wants everyone to work their asses off and be the best, but he wants a workplace culture of community where everyone works to raise their teammates up rather than simply looking out for number one. Now, there are positives and negatives to both these philosophies. It's true that competition typically brings out the excellence within competitors. When you're going up against someone, you want to win, so you're going to give it everything you have. However, if things get too competitive on an individual level, they might seek to sabotage the others rather than focusing solely on self-improvement, which is an issue that's known to plague Quasar. On the other hand, the teamwork element of Star Nova encourages an attitude of working to better the group, and an idol is nothing if her unit fails. However, when the focus is all on the collective, weaknesses on the individual level might be downplayed and underperformers could still be allowed to drag down the rest of the group. What I'm getting at is that there's a give and take with both of these strategies, and I'd say that a balance is needed to actually extract the most out of the idols without threatening the structural integrity of the unit. Quasar has historically been on the extreme end of the competitive side of things. They push and fight to be number one and have become the best idol group in Japan as a result. But the actual work environment is very toxic, with cliques, bullying, and an overall lack of trust between the girls. There was one exception to this rule, which was back when Maria was with Quasar with a girl named Kana as the center. At this point, the present-day center Shiro was the number 2. Kana had successfully clawed her way to the top without pulling anyone else down. And while being the center may have put a target on her back, anyone who accomplishes such a feat commands a healthy degree of respect and authority over the unit. And Kana's overall friendly and uplifting personality rubbed off on the rest of the girls. Not entirely, of course. After all, Quasar was still structured as a competition where you could succeed or fail at any time. Furthermore, Kamijo, who was enraptured by the cutthroat nature of American business practice, still held absolute power over the group and would regularly shake things up to keep everyone on their toes. I really like this whole dynamic here. While Quasar are set up as the bad guys of the visual novel and are definitely portrayed in a mostly negative light, this look at their internal politics shows an overall amoral attitude towards success rather than an immoral one. And what's interesting is how this harsh system actually works in universe. In a lot of stories, both anime and Western, the power of love and friendship is always what triumphs over ruthless aggression. However, the intense and competitive culture of Quasar is what pushed them to be the best, and even in their worst times, they're still a top-tier idol unit, and they have their extreme dedication to thank for it. Furthermore, with Kana as the center bringing the unit in a more friendly, softer direction, they start losing their edge. They're still the best in the world, but their lead noticeably shrinks under Kana's leadership, and it's attributed directly to this shift towards community. This is a surprisingly nuanced take from a story where our protagonists are underdog idols. But of course, something has to change. After all, Maria wouldn't have been traumatized by this. Well, as expected, the friendliness of Kana rubbed off on her too, and she lost a lot of that arrogance and drive she had at the start. As a result, she became happier, more satisfied, but she also stopped climbing the ranks, landing in a thoroughly middling position. She also just so happened to discover that Kana and Shiro had a bond that was a little more than just sisterhood. Yep, they were in a relationship, and it was serious, as opposed to just a series of hookups. Well, that made things a little sticky when Kamijo, unhappy with their performance, makes moves to push for a return to the competitive spirit. After a bit of a shakeup in the fan election rules, Kana and Shiro end up with an unprecedented first-place tie. Kamijo then sets up a new competition. Quasar will release 2 versions of their upcoming album, one featuring Kana, one featuring Shiro. Whichever girl sells more copies will be the center, while the other will be immediately fired. This is a ploy to both boost sales as well as shake up the girls by destroying a bond that he surely knew about. Well, to make a long story short, Kana fell into a somewhat depressive state where she just kind of went on autopilot, while Shiro took on the competition wholeheartedly. Eventually, Shiro won and did the only thing she thought she could at the moment. She knew the relationship with Kana couldn't continue anymore. She also knew that she had to solidify her position, as without Kana's stabilizing presence, Quasar would once again become this hyper-competitive landscape. In her mind, the best thing to do would be to cut everything off and force Kana to move on. So as Kana is sad and upset, Shiro steels herself and tells her that she never truly loved her or even liked her. That she used her to make her weak so she could take the crown. She pushes her away and leaves her while at the same time hardening her own heart. But that's the thing. She was lying. She did care. And one thing about Shining Song Star Nova is that while it has a lot of really neat nuance and interesting perspectives, subtlety is not its strong suit. It's made very clear throughout the story that Shiro really did love Kana. Even years later, she still wore Kana's choker in Quasar's performances. Whenever Maria asks her about Kana, the cold veneer slips just a bit. And in the endings where Shiro and Kana meet again, Shiro never turns her down. As much as this flashback is meant to tell the story of Maria and Quasar, it really tells the story of Shiro and how she became a cold, heartless manipulator. at least on the surface. She became the embodiment of everything Kamijo preached, and in doing so, became the Empress of Entertainment. Shido is a very interesting antagonist, and one that I kinda wish we got to see more of. See, she only really features in a handful of routes, though she does play a major role in Sasame's, which I'll get into later. She's this ruthless, aggressively competitive person, though she does have a soft streak, and she has a tendency to catch feels for people, though she does her utmost to repress it. After betraying Kana, Quasar becomes that hyper-competitive hellscape that Kamijo craves, and Maria, now having lost her extreme ambition, no longer fit in. Of course, some of the other girls catch on and target her, destroying her property and at one point making her literally eat shit. She didn't last much longer. This was Maria's fall from grace, the moment where she truly internalized the horrors that could unfold within an industry that so many put on a pedestal. So she tells all this to the producer, who's been listening with a laser focus. She's endured a lot, seen a lot of shit both literally and figuratively. Maria basically took Pandora's box right to the face. But just like the Greek myth, with all the bad comes one tiny bit of good. Hope. See, the producer's an alright kind of guy, who only became a producer because he loved the spectacle, what idols were supposed to represent. He couldn't let Maria leave the industry with such a negative disposition, certainly not under his care. So he basically tells her, I've got your back. We're going up against Quasar? We'll do it as a team. Your dream has always been a performance at the Tokyo Dome? I'll make it happen. I want to help you be happy. And at that point, Maria's mind is fucking short-circuiting. Not once has anyone ever showed her genuine care in her time as an idol, and as tumultuous as it may be, she's in a place where she can start to recover from her past trauma. I like that. That shit's wholesome as fuck. Maybe a little cliche, but honestly it was set up really well. And the second part of Maria's arc really starts to push forward. She was beaten down by her doubts, relived the horrors that set her on this negative road, and now she's ready to build back up and take on her dreams. And to make a long story very short, they did it. Aki stepped back, as I mentioned earlier, and things went smoothly within the group, and her newfound confidence and idealism inspired the group to work their asses off. And when the time came to perform at the Idol Grand Prix, despite Kamijo going so far as to announce Shido's retirement following their performance, Starnova won due to a single tiebreaker vote from Kana Kihara, former center of Quasar. A bit of a deus ex machina, sure, but it's not unrealistic to the point of absurdity. Also, it ties up Shido's side of things quite nicely, as she now has her own path towards redemption. I will say that I'm not a huge fan of how the climax of Maria's route comes in the face of a cliche, considering how the entire story explicitly dodges cliches a lot, but it's one weakness in an overall strong story. But then there's the epilogue. Maria finally gets that Tokyo Dome performance as her send-off. She does her performance, she thanks everyone, she's crying, and then she places a crown on Aki's head, handing over Starnova to her. Then Aki gives a speech and she starts crying, and god fucking damn it. You know, every route had one moment that made me get a lump in my throat, and in my notes I came to refer to them as tear-up moments. This was that moment for Maria. Everything came to a happy conclusion, and Maria is handing the future of Starnova over to Aki, and it's so supremely bittersweet and wholesome and shit. Maria as a character was surprisingly good. When she's a side character, which is during the common route and in the other girl routes, the remnants of her trauma are played up as kind of a gag. She'll spiral into this deep pit of despair for about 2 minutes, and the others will say, oh, Maria's just in flashback mode. But once you actually dig into her story, she has a very humanizing depiction of emotional scars and of trauma. Now, I'm not going to comment on the accuracy of that depiction because I'm no mental health expert, but as a storytelling mechanism, it's solid. I also loved how the themes of Shining Song Starnova as a whole play into her story route, and there were some really neat parallels between Maria and Shiro, with Maria starting out much like how Shiro turned out, and there was even some neat color inversion in their uniforms during the climax. During the selection screen where you can choose which route to be on, Maria is on the far left, and I personally on my first read-through went from left to right, and this was a good first story. And I definitely appreciate how it gives us a look inside Quasar that we don't get in all the others, which adds an entirely new dynamic to the Starnova-Quasar rivalry. I think that actually her route does a great job of setting up Quasar as a set of characters rather than a mindless villain, which is good for world building. So yeah, solid start. Not gonna waste any more time because this video is already gonna be long as fuck. Okay, so I know I made Aki seem like a bit of a bitch, but she's actually, I think, one of the best characters of the visual novel. So as the tagline for this section implies, Aki's got some layers. On the very surface is her stage persona. See, she entered the idol world at 12 years old as the center of a preteen unit. She was trained to play the role of the Imuto, or little sister character. And on top of the fact that she was actually young, she's always been physically small, so she had all the characteristics to pull off a believable lolly persona. When not performing, she's incredibly ambitious and dedicated to becoming a top idol. She's even said that she wants to be the best in the world and will stop at nothing to get there, though she sometimes takes it too far, completely disregarding anything other than her goal and whatever is immediately in her way. She can be aggressive at times, but also fairly mischievous and snarky, which resulted in the others dubbing her the shit lolly. Though this is her most common demeanor, little bits of her Imuto persona do slip in, though it's questionable as to how much is her genuinely trying to mess with people and how much is just force of habit. Like, she'll refer to herself as a child despite being 18, she'll call the producer Oni-chan, which is a cutesy way to refer to a brother in Japanese. You know, things like that. But beneath all of that, she can be fiercely loyal and protective while also demonstrating a lot of vulnerability. This is buried deep down, and I'll get into it in more detail a bit further on. So what is it that makes up these three layers? Well, the Imuto layer is pretty self-explanatory. That was the character, the persona she built up for the public, and it makes sense that since she's been engaging with that persona for like a third of her life, it would bleed over into her offstage persona purely due to habit. The tough and driven persona is interesting. In part, it's absolutely within her personality. I think that chances are, this same character would still be highly driven and ambitious in a different setting. However, I think the extreme lengths she goes to and her brutally honest demeanor are, at least in part, a defense mechanism. And to properly set this up, I do need to talk a bit about Aki's history with two of the side characters, her mother Yumiko Kashiwagi and Oda Kenjiro, a high-level executive of Golden Calf, which is the music label that directly owns Quasar. These two characters have a fairly friendly relationship, which is somewhat odd when you consider Aki's ties to Star Nova, Quasar's rivals who are under contract with Soma Music, a label in direct competition with Golden Calf. Aki's also been shown to react pretty explosively towards Oda, often referring to him as that man, despite the fact that he could be a valuable career connection and his almost grandfatherly demeanor, which kinda goes against her ambitious persona. So obviously there's something else there, and it's pretty nicely set up. See, Aki grew up in extreme poverty and on multiple occasions witnessed her father abusing her mother, though I don't think he was ever abusive to Aki directly. Over time, the family's financial situation worsened, and Yumiko realized that Aki was a talented and endearing girl, so she started ingratiating her into the entertainment world in the hopes of getting her a well-paid position, which pissed off the father as he considered it dishonorable. Eventually, Yumiko leaves her abusive husband and takes Aki away, and also manages to get Aki an interview with Oda and Kamijo over at Golden Calf. Kamijo quickly rejected her from consideration for Quasar, but Oda saw something in her and signed her as the center of an experimental unit he was working on, Strawberry Pink. Over the next few years, the group achieved a respectable level of success, and Aki was no longer living in poverty, though Yumiko had developed an alcohol dependency. It was at this point when Oda revealed that, well, let's just say that he likes them young, and he was interested in a more up-close and personal dynamic with the then 14-year-old Aki. So naturally, she gets the fuck out of Dodge and runs to her mother, and also decides to quit being an idol because, well, she was in a pretty emotionally turbulent state at that point. Yumiko at that point decided to do what any loving mother would do. Chastised her for not fucking the old guy and then beat the shit out of her. So yeah, that all went unresolved, but it's not like she could really force anything out of Aki at that point. So Aki quit, and a few years later signed on to Star Nova with renewed determination, this time vowing to do whatever it takes to be the best. So to me, this is a very interesting situation, and honestly, this relatively simple story does a great job at setting up her personality and motivations, as well as nicely teasing the root of a lot of her issues. Now, this is pretty explicitly stated later on, but Aki craves the love and approval of Yumiko, which is why she pushes so hard to be an idol. Because Yumiko is happy and proud when Aki does well, even though the overall dynamic is incredibly toxic. And this also shows an interesting case that I don't see a whole lot in media. So Yumiko was the victim of domestic abuse. It's an awful situation, and it was made pretty clear that Aki's father was the instigator and Yumiko was 100% a victim. But over time, Yumiko's initial pure desires morphed, and the emotional damage she suffered started taking a toll on their relationship. Eventually, Yumiko herself became an abuser, which is sadly all too common in the real world. While most abuse victims do not go on to be abusive, it is a fact that most abusers were themselves abused at some point. If you've ever heard of the cycle of abuse, this is what it's referring to. Abuse can create more abusers, especially when children are involved, as they grow up viewing abuse as normal, so they don't have the visceral, this is wrong reaction that a child from a healthy home would have. And this scenario is also interesting because as the story goes on, there's a very clear rift forming between Aki and Yumiko, which eventually comes to a head after Yumiko is arrested for fraud and Aki cuts her off. But despite this toxic divide, there was still love underneath. Remember, Aki always wanted her mother's love, and Yumiko originally left her husband out of a desire to protect Aki. So while their relationship was extremely unhealthy, it was not as one-dimensional as it may seem. So let's bring this back to Aki specifically. A lot of her drive is for the sake of her mother's approval, right? Well, as I mentioned earlier, she has a bit of a tendency to overdo things. She'll work herself to exhaustion, ignore injuries, all that lovely shit. Well, one really neat little detail in her story is that she's at her most honest, her most genuine when at her breaking point. When she's completely broken down or when the stakes are extremely high, that's when her innermost self comes out. The first time we really see this is after she overworks herself to the point where she damages her health. At this point, she'd made it a habit of spending her evenings hanging out with the producer, likely to escape her toxic home environment. And on one night, she was talking and admitted that she was having doubts about being an idol. She's burnt out, and if she had an easy out and knew she could live comfortably, she might very well take it. Now, let me be perfectly clear. This was the first time Aki's mask had slipped throughout the story, and almost immediately after, she collapses and seizes up because she had broken her body down through overwork. A few days later, she passes out while training late, and the producer puts her to bed so we can make sure she's alright. Now, at this point, she's absolutely wrecked physically and emotionally, and she trusts this guy who's taken up this almost parental role. I mean, it's not quite the role of a parent, but he does try to take care of her and acts in her best interest, which is new to her. So she tells him that she's tired, she's burned out, she's scared to let the mask slip and that everyone will see through the facade she puts up on a daily basis. She's scared and vulnerable despite the tough front. And this was one of the most genuine emotional moments in the entire visual novel. Seriously, the characterization here is phenomenal. It showcases these different aspects of Aki's character, and even though they conflict on the surface, it all fits together and makes sense. Plus, it goes a long way in endearing Aki to the reader. As much as she's never portrayed as a genuinely bad person, she can definitely be irritating at times. When you see the underlying causes for this behavior, it becomes harder to really hold it against her. Aki's route is probably my favorite of the 7, and it's moments like these that really solidify that. And for me, since Aki's route was the second one I read, having that more intimate view of her internal personality made me more aware of when that heart of gold would slip through. For example, in Julie's route, she's attacked by a crazed fan, and tiny Aki charges forward without a second thought to defend her. In all the routes, when they're prepping for their most climactic performances, she agrees to stand behind whoever is the center despite her own ambitions. At one point, she pretty much forcibly helps Mika clean up her apartment out of genuine concern. When it matters, she pulls through for her friends, and that's pretty heartwarming. So a lot of Aki's story is centered around the struggle between the grind and her own personal well-being, and I think that the producer injects an interesting dynamic to that. So in that scene where Aki is exhausted and spilling her guts, she tells the producer that if he asks, she'll give up her idol career and basically be his housewife. She says she doesn't want to keep fighting and she knows he'll take care of her, so she'll do what she can to make him happy. Well, while I'm sure any man would be tempted by such an offer, the producer has a good amount of ambition himself. See, he became a producer because he loves idols and what they represent to the average person. He tells her, hey, I want you to take care of yourself, but I'm not gonna have you give up so easily. And I love that. I think a lot of writers would have structured the story so that the end point would be Aki realizing that she really didn't want to be an idol and quitting it all for a quiet life. But really, it's not that she hates being an idol, it's that her mindset and her upbringing in regards to her career were toxic and that was poisoning the genuine love she has for what she does. As a member of Star Nova, she doesn't have to worry about some creepy executive trying to take advantage of her. She doesn't have to worry about her teammates trying to stab her in the back. She's part of an actual unit that seeks to work together to achieve greatness. Again, it's a nice nuanced take on a played out scenario. And then we also get a nice dose of reality because Aki doesn't suddenly just resolve all her issues. It's not like she can just erase the habits of how she's always conducted herself despite that heart-to-heart. She's in a much better work environment than she used to be, and she does show some improvements as a person, but she's still prone to overwork and ends up getting injured and ignoring it, which obviously leads to it getting worse until it spirals out of control and she has to go to the hospital, and the recovery time is cutting it pretty close to a big performance. Now, I like to think that this is a metaphor for Aki's internal struggles. See, all things considered, the injury was nothing major. If she'd actually told her teammates or the producer, they could have helped her and she'd probably be back at 100% with just a couple days rest. But because she tried to hide it out of fear, which admittedly was encouraged by Yumiko, it very nearly ended her career and put her in a position where she could potentially hurt her friends by not performing when they need her. And that's a lot like how she's been acting for a long time. She pushes and pushes, never trusting or accepting help, and she hurts herself. She burns out. And it's a really nice touch that a positive influence like Star Nova, like the producer, isn't enough to just fix her issues. Even later on, when Aki cuts Yumiko out of her life, eliminating that toxic influence, the scars are still there and she still has those same impulses. She still worked herself so hard that she hurt herself. And of course, in that moment, her true self comes to the forefront again. She's in a better place, but she's still tired. She's still scared. She still doesn't know what she wants for her future. And this time, the producer tells her that whatever she decides, he'll support her. She finally has that unconditional love and support that she was denied throughout her childhood. And this time, she decides for herself that she's gonna continue. That this is something she wants and she's doing it for her. Of course, she still works a bit too hard. She really doesn't know how to take it easy. But she pushes and pushes for their final showdown against Quasar, and in that moment, everything, all the overwork catches up with her. As her health begins to fail in the middle of her performance, she hallucinates and imagines life as a normal, everyday schoolgirl with a caring mother and good friends. It's a pretty happy scenario. The tedium of school life is still presented in a positive light. with calming music, a warm color palette, and positive language throughout. But before long, she has to come back to reality and answer that one question she never came to terms with. The people in her mind each ask her one by one, will Kashiwagi Aki become the number one? And that's just it. Is she willing to sacrifice quite literally everything to be the best, to accomplish her goals? And at this point, the player has a choice. Will Aki be number one? Spoiler alert, saying yes leads to the bad end. She pushes herself even further and gives the best performance anyone has ever seen, but she fucking dies in the process. Her body gives out completely and she goes out in a blaze of glory. If you say no, she confronts the specter of her mother. But it's not the mother of her reality, but the caring mother from this dream world. She holds her close and tells her, "You don't have to try so hard. No matter what happens, I love you and I'm proud of you." And that's all Aki ever wanted from her. She starts crying, asking why she never said that, why she was never a proper mother, why she never loved her. Yep, that's the fucking tear-up moment right there. Even just rereading this scene as I'm writing the script gets me every time. It all just hits her and she realizes that she doesn't want to destroy her body and mind for the approval that never seems to come. So she steps back and lets her teammates take the forefront. They lose to Quasar. And you know what? It's all good. They still got the future, and everyone is still proud of her. She may not be number one, but she did well. She still has a fruitful career as an idol. This time, she really, truly wants to keep going. She wants to be an idol, not to be number one, but because she likes being an idol. And when it's time to actually retire, she does so proudly and takes up that happy home life that she's always wanted. She settles down with a producer and has a kid. And years later, she does take a trip to meet up with Yumiko again and to introduce her to their son. And you know what? Once all the greed, the alcoholism, and her own abuse scars were given some time to heal, all that was left was the love for her daughter and the shame for having hurt her. So they see each other for the first time in probably 15 years or so. Honestly, the timeline was pretty vague here. But Aki was able to face her mother, no longer as an idol, but as a mother herself. And Yumiko was proud of her. Things were gonna be alright. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that reconciling with someone who abused you is necessarily a good thing, but in this scenario, it's a powerful conclusion to the story. All that conflict and all the themes of Aki's story revolved around her mind and her mother. It was nice that they were able to tie up that loose end. It would have been a functional story regardless, but now it feels truly complete. Aki is such a phenomenal character, and I really had to stop myself from going on and on about her, not just in this section of the video, but in other routes as well. So yeah, that was pretty fucking good. Mika. While she's not my favorite character, she is the one that I relate to the most on a personal level. And her story is also not my favorite, but I think it's probably the best at playing off the overall themes of idealism versus reality, and it's also one of the more emotionally powerful routes. As a character, Mika embodies the archetype of the NEET, which stands for not in employment, education, or training. Interestingly, this archetype is far more commonly seen in male characters than female, so that alone is a bit of a twist. She's also hugely into nerdy and alternative culture. She likes anime, manga, video games, and gothic Lolita. Not gonna lie, I'm into these things myself. Well, not really gothic Lolita because I'm a guy, but I do find it aesthetically pleasing. The reason she joined Star Nova is because she was watching an idol anime that got her hyped up, so she signed up on impulse. So as you might expect, she's a bit naive. Also, as a shut-in, it's not too surprising that she has pretty severe social anxiety. It's not so bad that she can't function around others, but she's noticeably different. In fact, and this is just speculation on my part, I have a sneaking suspicion that Mika may be autistic. And I say that as an autistic dude myself. I obviously can't be certain, but she's bad at socializing, doesn't really understand people, has a tendency towards depressive thoughts, and has an almost obsessive passion about the things she likes. Just saying. One of her interesting quirks is that she's almost constantly role-playing like she's in a dark fantasy anime or video game. She'll act like she's a commander in some evil army, and she'll make references to being underleveled or afflicted by certain status conditions. She also regularly refers to the producer as Black Knight. Actually, let me pronounce that correctly. Buraku Naito! Yeah, it just wouldn't be Japanese voice acting without a little English. Now, this roleplay initially comes off as just an interesting anime quirk, but it actually goes a bit deeper than that. To her, roleplay is a coping mechanism that helps her engage with others without completely breaking down. And honestly, that's pretty smart. Roleplay basically acts as a filter between the real world and her, so she can process social interactions without getting overwhelmed by them. Of course, this is probably not a great long-term solution, but for the initial goal of just being functional, it's a good idea. Now, due to her nature as a shut-in, she doesn't have all that much real-world knowledge and experience. As you might expect, that poses some difficulties when she joins an idol unit because of an idol anime, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not a good representation of the industry. So naturally, that can cause some difficulties. If her head is up in the clouds and she's enraptured with the idealism of the idol industry, it could really fuck her up when she's hit with how it is in reality. But on the other hand, there's something very endearing in that idealism that's extremely hard to fake, so she could really appeal to audiences. And besides, having a passion for your work is in itself a big plus, both for personal satisfaction and for overall performance. So there's a lot of contrast there. Mika's route is basically a long series of ups and downs, soaring highs and devastating lows. More so than the others, Mika's story is a roller coaster of emotions, and it's pretty neat to step back and look at it. So Starnova has their hit single with their new center, who at this point is Mika. Obviously, this is pretty awesome. They're finally on the map, things are going well for them. But with that success comes change. Mika's not great with change. I mean, look at her past. She spent her days cooped up in her apartment in one fantasy world or another, and that's just how things were. And even in Starnova, she talks about how she was happy before they became successful. As long as they could keep on keeping on, she didn't need any massive popularity and was content to just go with the flow. She likes her routines, which again makes me think she's probably autistic, but that's neither here nor there. She starts doubting herself, and when you start thinking you're worthless, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and she starts underperforming in the group practices, which are now less frequent due to everyone having increasingly busy schedules. The girls are all a little frustrated by the unit's stagnation, at least in terms of their skills, and Mika's just like, ah shit, it's all my fault, and she just freaks out and runs away. And that's another thing. Mika's obsession with her other worlds is likely in itself a defense mechanism. Whenever the anxiety takes over, she can always go back to her apartment and find an escape. Maybe it's an anime, or a manga, or a video game. She always has a space where she can feel safe and comfortable. But here's the thing, while having an escape can be valuable, it shouldn't become your permanent residence. And realistically, Starnova's predicament doesn't fall squarely on Mika's shoulders. Yeah, maybe she should step up more as Starnova's center, and yes, she probably should be taking things more seriously. But you could say pretty much the same thing for all the other members of the group as well. They all had to deal with the sudden surge of popularity, and none of them really adjusted perfectly to that shift at that point. And none of them had to deal with the additional pressure of being the center. So after Mika runs off, the girls immediately feel pretty bad. I mean, they all care for one another, and they realize that things are probably harder for Mika than the rest of them. So they come to an agreement that they'll do everything they can to support Mika from the rear and make her feel as welcome as possible. Even Aki agrees to this without much fight because she actually does like Mika as a person, and she knows it's the right thing to do. See, that bitch can be wholesome when she wants to be. So they rally behind her and hold a mini celebration before their next performance. And at that moment, the crowd fucking loves her, so she's in a good place again. And on top of that, the producer was able to get her a part voicing a background character in an anime. As you might imagine, Mika was happy, and the experience was overall very positive. She had a great time and made a very good impression on the other voice actors and the production staff. Now, I'd like to really quickly point out something really neat about Mika's artistic design. Whenever she's really excited about something, she gets a literal twinkle in her eyes. Like actual stars of light replace her pupils, and it's so fucking adorable. But it also gives a great visual indication of when she's actually hyped up, and I love it. At this point, having worked on the anime and with Starnova doing extremely well internally and externally, she dropped the roleplay almost entirely. As I mentioned earlier, subtlety is not this visual novel's strong suit, so of course it's brought up in conversation. Look, Sam Yang is a talented writer, but goddamn, he has a habit of drawing attention to every clever thing he comes up with. While that makes it easier for me as an analyst, I think that in general, it would be okay to let the audience figure out some of this shit on their own. This conversation is a perfect example. The fact that Mika drops her role-playing because she's in a good emotional state is really awesome character development, is building on an established character trait, and it gives us a window into her personality. When we get a conversation that basically goes, oh hey, you haven't role-played in a while. Oh yeah, I guess I'm starting to take things a bit more seriously. It just feels kinda patronizing. Like we the readers weren't trusted to be able to pick up on that, or at least to internalize the emotions the story was presenting. You don't have to pull us toward it so we can admire your cleverness. Sorry, this shouldn't annoy me as much as it does, but I get irrationally angry whenever I see something that's above average but is just barely held back from being great. And I do think that Shining Song Starnova's overall unwillingness to be subtle is one of its biggest weaknesses, which holds it back in the face of its very real strengths. Okay, that diatribe aside, let's get back to Mika. So things are going very well for her, and like I said earlier, when she went to work with that anime studio, everyone left happy, and the producer was able to leverage that. He pulled some strings and got her to be the last-minute replacement as the lead role in the Black Opera live-action TV series. Black Opera just so happens to be Mika's favorite anime, so she's hype as fuck, as any superfan would be. So then there's this really neat scene where Mika and the producer pull an all-nighter watching Black Opera under the pretense of studying the source material. One episode in and he's hooked. So now both of them are hype as fuck to get to work on the show. But of course, let's not forget that this is a live-action TV adaptation. If that sounds like it should be a big red flag, you're right. When Mika gets to the set, it turns out that the project really doesn't reflect on the source material in anything but the name and the core premise. It was just that the executives saw cash cow and wanted to capitalize on an IP with a low-budget series full of pointless fan service. It was a big shock to Mika when she realized that ultimately she was only there because of her body and her reputation as an idol. The people in charge didn't love black opera like she did. They just saw dollar signs and knew that boobs and butts were an easy way to make that happen and potentially draw a few new eyes to the source material. Now, Mika is upset, but ultimately she and the producer signed a contract. But eventually, things reach a breaking point. After an uncomfortable ecchi scene involving tentacles, the male lead basically comes out and says, "Yeah, I can't do this shit. I know I'm playing a character, but I'm not comfortable doing all these disgusting things to someone else." And after an uplifting scene where all the cast and crew, most of whom were massive fans of the source material, all expressed their disdain, they managed to fire up the director who's all like, "Alright, yeah, fuck this shit. Let's actually make something good. We may not have much time left before the show airs, but we'll just have to work overtime to get it done." Now let me tell you something. As someone who likes to create, I mean, this channel is basically my artistic outlet, working on a project when you're all fired up is an experience unlike any other. Like, holy shit, it is so much fun and it gives you so much satisfaction when you actually make progress. Like, I enjoy making videos in general, but every so often there's one that just completely hooks me and I'm basically in a constant flow state as I'm working. And I think this scene captures that mentality perfectly. When you get all hyped, it's like you're a completely different person, and in a group environment, that can absolutely rub off on the people around you. I was getting that sense of secondhand passion, and it was great, especially when they started narrating the scenes as they were filming them, and that twinkle in Mika's eyes really sold it. And another neat little thing that was actually subtle was that when they were filming shit like the tentacles, the dialogue boxes labeled the characters by their real names, so Mika was labeled Mika, but when they were all hyped up during these later scenes, they were labeled by their black opera characters, so Mika was labeled Sylvia Nightsong. It was a cool little detail that really went a long way in showing how immersed everyone was. So over the next few weeks, they rewrite and refilm the entire series, and everyone's excited to get to work on post-production for the upcoming release. Naturally, Mika and the producer have no hand in that, so they just have to wait for the premiere. So as you might expect, the girls all want to support Mika's big TV debut, so they all gather around to watch, and it's shit. Like, really bad. And that's another hard dose of reality. See, I wasn't lying when I said that having this burning, driving passion is an experience unlike any other, but that alone will not result in good quality work. You still need to put in the time, effort, and skill to really make that passion shine, and Black Opera simply didn't have the time or the resources to make that happen. I mean, they were literally rewriting the script minutes before filming, which I can tell you does not do the story structure any favors. And in addition, both leads were inexperienced. They had no real chemistry, and it was Mika's first acting role ever, so she had no idea what the fuck she was doing. Everyone was so excited, so ready to make their magnum opus, but it just wasn't good enough. So Mika's upset and runs home, where she does something very stupid. She goes online and reads the comments on the Chan. Well, you've got your standard shitposting, the speculation, the unfounded rumors. People were saying she was just in it for the money, that she slept with the director. You know, all that petty shit. Now, Mika is fragile in general, but she's also in an emotionally vulnerable state, so these words cut her deeply. But I think ultimately she'd have been capable of recovering from this on her own. So I think that given time, she'd have actually been just fine. But then she gets to the stuff that's actually horrendous. Anyone have her info? Lol, rape her. Docs please. Fuck her till she squeals. Things went from mean to awful real quick, because that's just how the internet is sometimes. Now, I'm generally an advocate for thick skin, and I think it's important for people to be able to give and take a little shit talk. But there's a fucking line. And doxing, rape threats, all this truly vile shit absolutely crosses that line. And it takes an incredibly strong-willed person to be able to handle all that severe, concentrated negative energy. And unfortunately, Mika is not a particularly strong-willed person. She doesn't handle any attention well, much less negative attention. So she starts having a legit panic attack, and of course, right at that moment, someone throws a fucking brick through her apartment window. People were not happy with the show, which in itself is fair, but when it's taken into the real world, that's not okay. And it's not like the situation got much better either. The executives of the show surprisingly still wanted them to film season 2, but they were very insistent that they go back to the titties. So all that passion they had, all that excitement was quite literally for nothing. It accomplished nothing, and some crazed fan even took to vandalizing Star Nova's headquarters, spray painting insults directed towards Mika. And that was her breaking point. In her eyes, it was all her fault. She ruined Black Opera, something she'd put up on a pedestal. She dropped the ball, and she did what she always does when she gets overwhelmed. She ran away, back to the comfort of her apartment and its fantasies, where normally she could just wait it out and the bad feelings would go away. But this time, she looks at the figurines, the anime, the manga she once loved, and they feel wrong, like she betrayed them. She picks up her prized Black Opera figurine, a limited edition Sylvia Nightsong that she spent an entire year saving up for. her prized possession, something that always cheered her up. But today, it did the exact opposite. Black Opera now left a sour taste in her mouth, and in a fit of rage, of self-loathing, she screams, "I killed Night Song!" and throws her figurine against the wall, smashing it to pieces. The music cuts out as the realization dawns. She just destroyed the one thing that she loved most, that she put a part of herself into. She breaks down, crying and wailing as the music returns, stronger than ever. All the grief, all the fear, all the pure agony comes out at once, and she just cries. This was a really tough scene to get through. Even watching my recording over to write this part of the script still makes my chest tighten. This scene is just a raw wave of emotions, and holy shit, that spiral into a tormented depression was just so fucking real. Everything was set up so well. The filming scenes were such an incredible high, only for everything to come crashing down all at once into a devastating new low. And on top of that, I think Mika's voice actress did a stellar job conveying the hurt and pain in her voice. There were no words, no monologue, just pure, unadulterated anguish. If it's not abundantly clear by now, this was my tear-up moment for Mika's route. But like most fits of emotion, this one didn't last forever. The producer found her and she was still upset but had mostly calmed down. She had that cathartic cry, and now the producer took her to a safer place and kept her company through the night so she wasn't alone. As bad as she was feeling before, as much as she did have a breakdown, she was able to stabilize. But she wasn't the same. She was colder, more serious, jaded. She went back to the set the next day and did the ecchi scenes like a pro. She'd hardened her heart and basically gave up on the passion and idealism she had at the beginning. She was able to get through the bastardization that was Black Opera, but she lost a piece of herself in the process. She even goes so far as to lure the producer into her room and flat out tells him that she's curious about sex and wants to bang him. But of course, the producer is an idolist himself. He became a producer because he loved idols. He couldn't let her be like this. So he's all like, "No, you're more than sex appeal to me, and you have to keep pushing on so that there's always another day to truly make a difference." So he's given her this pep talk, and I'm kinda getting hyped just going over it again. When it comes to any artistic venture, you gotta have some love for what you do, is what makes art worth engaging with. And it got through to her. So she says those two words that we haven't heard for so long. Black Knight? And she goes into her roleplay. She's on the precipice of battle. The enemies outnumber her, but she has a plan. She's going to put on a comeback performance like the world has never seen before. And the fucking twinkle comes back. That twinkle that she tried to kill just refuses to die, and Mika's fucking back. I fucking love it. She had her naive highs and her crushing lows, but now she's at a point of balance. She still has that love and passion for what she does, but she's also become accepting of reality as it exists, rather than how it would be portrayed in one of her animes. Earlier, I likened the passion for Mika's work to my own work on this channel, and I think the analogy still holds up. I do get that passion, that excitement when I make my videos, and it's a big part of what keeps me pushing forward with my content and makes me want to produce bigger and better videos. But I can't let that overwhelm me. If I just pump out everything that comes to mind on a pure whim, quickly binge out the script, hastily record and edit, and just throw it out there, it's gonna suck dick. As much as the passion can really push out a solid first draft, I have to go back and revise. I have to take my time in recording and editing. But if I didn't have the passion for what I do, my videos would be boring. I put a piece of myself into every video, and if that part of me doesn't care, it'll reflect in the final product. There needs to be a balance, and I think Mika in that moment understood that. She was in a good place, and it wasn't that she was blinded by idealism. And then she gets attacked by a group of crazed fans who never explicitly said what they were gonna do, but the implications weren't good. Now, this was probably the worst thing that happened to her in terms of actual severity, like her actual physical safety was in danger. But this scene really didn't hit as hard as some of the others. Certainly not like that scene where all she did was break a fucking figurine. But you know what? I think it all makes sense. The attackers are fortunately stopped by the producer and some other staff members before anything bad can happen, and she is shaken up a bit. But she bounces right back. She and the producer have a heart-to-heart, and he doesn't push her to keep going. He just offers his unconditional support no matter what. She's adamant that she's gonna keep pushing forward. She's still going to hold their big comeback performance as planned to really set everyone straight. All the good and bad of her situation weighs down on her, but she's grown up and she's ready to face the world with her head held high. She goes out to face the crowd, not knowing what to expect. She'd gone through a lot of shit and a lot of people were still angry at her, but she had to do this. And it was a roaring success. Her fans had never truly given up on her. She fought, she persisted, and in the end, she was able to achieve that magic that her animes had promised. Mika's story is an interesting one. I don't think it's the best of the visual novel, and as a character, Mika isn't really my favorite, though I can't deny that she's fucking adorable. But this route hits so much harder than a lot of the others. I said earlier that Mika's story is a roller coaster of emotional highs and lows. And even more so than that, it's a nice coming-of-age story with a great message. Things like idol anime, that whole storybook mentality, can give people the wrong idea that with a pure heart, everything will always work out. And that's simply not always the case. But you have to keep persisting and you have to hold on to that excitement. Because if you don't care, if you don't get excited for the things you do, then what's the point of even doing them? Sure, you have to actually make sure you can navigate the real world, but it's okay to want to make it a better, more exciting place. Again, this wasn't my favorite route, but I'll be damned if it didn't stick with me. I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with Natsuki, or Natan as she likes to be called. Her character basically fits the archetype of a quirky country girl. It's very similar to the stereotype of the redneck here in the States. She's loud, energetic, extremely cheerful, kind-hearted, and a bit of a dolt at times. That's basically her entire character, and that's where the problems lie. Look, Natsuki is an extremely likable character, but she's not a good character, and that's because there's basically nothing all that wrong with her. She's a Mary Sue. One common theme throughout the entire visual novel is that the characters have to deal with their inner demons. Maria has her despair, Aki has her self-destructive tendencies, Mika has her self-doubt and anxiety, but Natsuki's problems are almost all external, and whatever internal issues she has can ultimately be blamed on external factors rather than something Natsuki-specific. I mean, she's played off as a goofball who does and says strange things at inappropriate times, but that's ultimately down to her having transplanted from the country to the city, and it's not even a particularly negative characteristic to begin with. She doesn't have any real flaws, and that's very disappointing. She's too much of a perfect person to be a good character. Now, I think she's phenomenal as a side character. As I said earlier, she's very fun and likable, but that works best as a feature rather than the focus. Now you may be wondering why I'm basically giving you my conclusion at the start of this section. Normally I put my opinions on her as a character at the end of this section to kind of wrap things up. Well, there's two reasons I'm doing this. Firstly, I think that understanding my issues with Natsuki as a character will make it much clearer why I have issues with her route on a structural level. And secondly, I think that Natsuki's route is not really the story of Natsuki as much as it's the story of the producer told through the lens of Natsuki. In a way, it's kind of like Maria's route, where a large part of her story was telling the story of Shiro. So I'm not going to go into individual plot points quite as much as for the other routes, because quite frankly, I don't think they matter all that much. So as much as I bashed Natsuki's route already, I do want to mention up front that her route does something really interesting that none of the others did. See, the common route ends right before they shoot the promotional video for their big single, and every route starts out with the single doing extremely well out of nowhere. It basically kickstarts the group to tell the story of a moderately popular idol group trying to make it big. Well, Natsuki's route also starts out like this, but unlike literally all the others, the group never really goes anywhere. They simply cannot replicate that initial success, and it's made clear less than 10 minutes in. One unfortunate truth about the entertainment industry, and this applies to all aspects of the industry, is that the supply of talent always has and always will outpace demand. Put simply, a lot of talented, hardworking people want to be on top, but there's simply not enough room. Think of any one-hit wonder that you personally enjoy. Chances are, the rest of that artist's music is of a similar quality, and may even be better, but you've never heard of it. It's simply not possible for everyone to get the spotlight they deserve or to maintain it once they do get it. And this is what's happening to Starnova. They're trying their damnedest to capitalize on their big hit, but nothing's working. And I think that's a really interesting perspective on the story as a whole. Everyone's doing everything right, but our protagonists simply aren't succeeding. So now I have to talk a bit about the producer. Despite being called Mr. Producer or Producer-san for basically the entire visual novel, with plenty of cheeky references to the running gag, he actually has a real name: Kaoru Nishiyama. There are also offhand references throughout to him having been an idol in his early years. Well, it turns out he was part of a moderately successful male idol group called Labrador, and he just went by Kaoru. Basically, Labrador had some successes, but ultimately never secured the numbers that the executives wanted, so the group was dissolved before they could really get off the ground. And as explained in Natsuki's route during a flashback, the Labrador producer basically didn't care. The producer, well, Kaoru, fuck, that's confusing, wanted to keep fighting for the group, but he basically just threw some cash at him and told him to go out and get laid. He didn't have that idealism or that respect for artistry, so Kaoru became a producer to be better, to actually deliver that spectacle rather than to secure the bag and dip out. That's his backstory. Nothing too crazy, but pretty solid right there. This has all revealed a good bit into Natsuki's story, but again, I'm skipping around a bit here because I honestly don't think the actual plot matters here as much as the message it's trying to convey. So now let's take a look at Natsuki. She grew up in the country in a family of farmers and embodies all the stereotypes, including a healthy respect for nature and hard work. So it's not like she was disillusioned with her simple life as some stories would do. Nah, she actually had a pretty happy upbringing and loves her home. Her thing is that she's always been fascinated with idols. At one point, she even sneaked away, took a train to the city for the first time, and went to see an idol unit perform live, even paying extra to meet one of them and get an autograph. 3 guesses as to which idol group she saw? Yep, it was Labrador. and she went home that day with a signed portrait of Kaoru himself. So over time, she never lost that excitement until one day she saw that her childhood crush Kaoru was going to be managing an idol unit of his own, so not having any immediate obligations, she left to pursue a career as an idol. Again, a pretty simple backstory, but it works. Now, one thing about Natsuki's route is that it's very clear that they were making parallels between Natsuki and the producer. They both joined an idol unit out of love for idols, and plot-wise, they both had a very similar experience. A surge of initial success followed by a slump where they were never able to make it big. They both have that passion for the industry and a desire to do things the right way rather than being sleazy and underhanded. So the main conflict of Natsuki's route is that in the face of their lack of success, which kept Star Nova on uneven footing the whole way through, Natsuki finds out that her family is in a lot of debt. It's never explicitly stated how much debt, but based on context clues, I'm thinking that it's something along the lines of 30 million yen, or roughly $300,000. Not the most ludicrous level of debt ever, but still more than a simple farming family would ever be able to pay back, especially once you take interest into account. So they're at risk of losing their farm, which has been in the family for hundreds of years, and Natsuki now wants to make it big so she can save the farm. So now let's get back to my problems with Natsuki's route. Can you guess why I'm not a fan of this conflict, despite it seeming perfectly fine on the surface? Natsuki's problems are all things that don't directly involve her. She's a good person with no real issues, and the driving conflict comes as the result of someone else's mistakes. She has nothing to really work through. The worst that she ends up really doing is, in pursuit of stepping up her game, she loses some of the idealism and passion that made the fans love her in the first place. But I wouldn't even consider that a character flaw. She's obviously stressed the fuck out, and I think that taking a bit too much of a stoic approach to her idling career is a completely natural response. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. Natsuki is too much of a perfect person to be a very good character. And that really baffles me. Sam Yang wrote the entire visual novel, and the other characters, while I think some are better than others, are all interesting, complex characters with their own flaws and virtues, and they all have their inner demons to work through. Natsuki really doesn't have any inner demons, and again, the worst of her actions is that in taking things too seriously, she leeches the passion out of herself. Now, that just means that her only flaw is literally that she cares too much, which is basically a hallmark of the Mary Sue. I think that there could have been something with this core premise, but there needed to be an internal character flaw with Natsuki that the issue with the farm could have exacerbated. As is, we get a story with a compelling conflict, but it doesn't really have any meat to it. I also take issue with the structure of Natsuki's route and how it fits into Shining Song Star Nova as a whole. In the route, there are basically 3 different types of story going on at different times. The first is the main plot, with Star Nova's troubles and Natsuki's family farm. The second is the flashbacks and the bits where it goes over the earlier histories of Natsuki and the producer. The last are these little comedic skits that don't really push the plot forward, but instead are just meant to insert a little bit of levity. These all work on an individual level for the most part, and they all have potential to build off of, but it's like they couldn't decide on what the overall tone of the story was and how it was going to be portrayed. Is this going to be a serious story about Natsuki trying to save her family's farm? Is it going to be about the producer being put into the position of his old producer and trying to be better? Or is it going to be a lighthearted, funny story? All of these can be legitimate answers, but there should have been a focus. It seems like they were all given equal time, and that just left it feeling disjointed. I mean, let's look at the comedic bits. They were genuinely funny, and one of the running gags was how Natsuki's family would randomly send her a metric shitload of food from the farm, way more than she could handle. It was a funny distraction, and I think it worked as something inserted in between the more serious story beats. But after the 3rd time they did this, it kinda got old, and I just wanted them to get back to the real story already. Although there was a reference to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at one point, which gives their route massive bonus points in my eyes. Other routes told multiple stories, so it's not the fact that there was a subplot that bothers me. I mean, Maria's route had the Quasar backstory, the Aki rivalry, and the Idol Grand Prix, but there was a clear focus at any given moment. First, there was the Aki rivalry that kickstarted the emotional breakdown which led to telling the story of Shido and Kana, which then fed into the renewed determination to lift Maria and the rest of Star Nova up to take on Quasar at the Idol Grand Prix. It all flowed together and each arc served as a part to a larger whole. Natsuki's route kinda felt like a complete mismatch of different ideas thrown together without any consideration for the complete picture. It kinda jumped between Star Nova and the farm, and a fucking alpaca, and then back to the farm. They were all tangentially connected, but felt distinctly separate in a way that just was really disappointing to me. But then there's the ending, and I definitely have mixed feelings about it. As I mentioned earlier, one thing I do appreciate about Natsuki's route is how it looks at and accepts failure as a possibility. Now, this is the only route where Star Nova straight up fails as a unit. Eventually, they just weren't pulling numbers, and the record label canceled their contract, and as a result, it was just a matter of time before the unit would have to disband. But what they did with it was pretty nice. The girls and staff all came together to let Natsuki do an impromptu performance for her family so she can finally return with her head held high. And then all the girls go their own way, doing everything from modeling, to voice acting, to management. Star Nova may have failed, but they all valued their experiences and all went on to have fruitful careers and lives, even if it didn't end up as they expected. It's a nice message, and it's true. You may not achieve your initial dreams, and it may not even be your fault. but you can still end up happy in a different way. Although they did kinda Deus Ex Machina away the whole farm plot point. Basically, Nemu, who I'm gonna get into in the next section, is a rich heiress and used her family's wealth and influence to pressure the bank into not foreclosing on the farm, allowing Natsuki's family to pay back their loan at their leisure. I fucking hate when conflicts get resolved like that. Like, come on, that's not thematically consistent with anything the story's trying to tell, and the driving issue is resolved by something completely unrelated to the main character's struggles. I mean shit, Natsuki ended up as a successful TV host. Why not make it so that her money from that was able to keep the debt collectors away? That would have fit into how everyone was able to find success despite Starnova's failure so much better than just having rich Nemu fix everything with daddy's money. Okay, so I have to come clean here. Earlier in the video, I told a lie. I said that every single route had a moment that really hit me hard and made me tear up a bit. That wasn't true. Natsuki's route had no such moment. There were emotional moments, but nothing particularly powerful. Each of the other 6 routes had one, but sadly, Natsuki's route was a cut below the rest in this regard as well. So yeah, Natsuki's story wasn't horrendously bad or anything, but I'm kinda surprised that it's like this. I would understand if there were different writers for all the different routes, but there weren't, so I don't see how this one route was so much worse than the rest. And it had some good ideas, some good setup that simply lacked a proper payoff. But I would have really liked it if more care was given to the story and to Natsuki as a character. I think if she had some real flaws, maybe things would have turned out a little bit better for her. Ah well, I guess I'll just have to choose to remember her as the lovable side character in the other routes. I'm gonna start this out by saying that Nemu is a really neat character, and when I talk about how Shining Song Star Nova plays around with character tropes, she's what comes to mind. Why is that? Well, it's because she's one of my favorite depictions of the yandere character archetype. So what is a yandere? Well, googling the definition will tell you it's a character, usually a girl, who fits the archetype of being genuinely kind, loving, or gentle, as well as obsessed with their love interest, sometimes demonstrating this through violent behavior. I don't think that's entirely accurate. The yandere is generally depicted as a normally kind girl, often with very soft facial features to accentuate this characterization, and they always seem to keep a chef's knife on them and are prone to fits of psychopathic rage. That seems a bit far-fetched for a story like Shining Song Star Nova, right? Well, Nemu is a really interesting take on the yandere trope. But before I really get into her yandere-ness, let me give you a little background. Nemu is a rich heiress. Both of her parents are powerful and wealthy business executives who married more for the benefit to their companies than for love. In my notes, I described her personality as kind, motherly, and flirty, and I think that's the perfect description. She generally tries to be nice to the people around her and has a habit of wanting to take care of people. She's also the type to instinctively flirt with the people around her to the point where there are constant comedic references to her pheromones. And to be clear, it's not the kind of manipulate people into getting my way flirting that you might expect, it's just how she is. Another interesting facet that isn't really explored is that she intentionally acts like a bit of a ditz, but is actually highly intelligent and perceptive. She can read people exceptionally well, and the running joke is that the little heart-shaped strand of hair on her head is actually an antenna that can read minds. It's a neat little character quirk, though I would've liked to see it be more than just a surface level thing. Okay, so now one thing I have to say is that all these character traits are 100% genuine. A lot of yanderes basically put on a kind mask to hide their jealousy, obsession, and rage. But this is actually how Nemu is 90% of the time. It's just that every so often, she'll slip into a state where she gets all scary and willing to do violence on people. This is played up as a joke in the other routes, but it's made very clear that it's a completely separate state of mind than her normal state. Okay, so now I want you to take a minute and extract yourself from the world of anime and fiction. If you saw someone who was like this, who was kind most of the time, but slipped into these dissociative fits of rage, what would you think was going on? I'd imagine that most of you would probably suspect mental illness. And you'd be right. Nemu's route explores something very interesting that on reflection seems obvious with pretty much every yandere ever. They are mentally ill. People don't act that way without something else going on, but it's rarely ever explored in any kind of depth. Nemu's characterization is actually one of the best in the visual novel, and I appreciated it so much more on a second reading because I was able to see the slow progression of her mental illness. And once again, I'm going to point out that I'm no expert on mental health, so I won't be commenting on the accuracy of how Shining Song Star Nova portrays mental illness, only its use in its storytelling. In anime and visual novels, the yandere trope is usually used in one of two ways. Firstly, they can be a source of conflict, or maybe even an outright antagonist. Secondly, they can be comedic relief if the writers take the character into the realm of absurdity. Shining Song Star Nova throws that to the wind by introducing the concept of Nemu being mentally ill. Now, I'm obviously not going to try to diagnose her as that would be wildly inappropriate, but let me list off her symptoms. Paranoid delusions, memory repression, false memories, hallucinations, violent outbursts, and dissociation. And based on context clues from the visual novel, my guess is that her condition is partly genetic, partly trauma-induced, and made worse by her high-stress career as an idol. One characteristic of Nemu's route is that a lot of the information about her history and her condition is revealed piece by piece. I'm going to be giving you the whole story, but just know that as a reader, that doesn't come at you all at once. And honestly, I think it's extremely well done. Plus, Nemu's route utilizes the unreliable narrator strategy, where because of her illness affecting her memory, some pieces of the story are omitted or altered to conform to the false reality created by her paranoid delusions. I personally love unreliable narrators when they're done well, so this really tickled me, and the payoff was absolutely stellar when the real truth started coming to light. So Nemu is actually the illegitimate daughter of her father and a small-time idol named Senu, whose career ended shortly after becoming pregnant with Nemu. She took care of Nemu while her father provided plenty of financial support. However, Senu was also mentally ill with many of the same symptoms as adult Nemu. Now at the start, it was completely manageable. Sometimes she'd have some issues, but by all accounts, she was a great mother who loved her daughter dearly. It's just that the one thing that would consistently trigger her episodes was anything to do with idols. Despite no longer being an idol herself, she was obsessed, and whenever anything idol related would pop up, the world around her would cease to exist. However, once the TV program or whatever it was ended, she regained her senses. So for the most part, no harm, no foul. However, her condition began to get worse. The episodes would become more frequent and could sometimes go for days on end. She would spend hours upon hours watching her old performances and dancing along, only to rewind them and start over once they ended. As a result, Nemu, who was a toddler at this point, wasn't being fed or cleaned or put to bed, and she was beginning to show signs of neglect and malnutrition. Eventually, her father's wife Haruna performed a wellness check as Senu had not cashed any of the recent child support checks and saw Senu dancing away while Nemu was sitting in the corner, extremely malnourished and gravely ill. So she did what I think anyone would do, attempted to take Nemu to the hospital for medical care. Senu lost her shit, lashing out and genuinely attempting to kill both Haruna and Nemu. At this point, it was clear that she could no longer even care for herself, much less a child. So Senu was committed to a private mental health facility, the media was informed of a tragic car accident, and Haruna took Nemu in, and to avoid any negative press, claimed her as her own daughter. Nemu didn't quite remember it like that. In fact, she repressed most of these memories. All she could really remember was the happy times with her mother before she became non-functional. Furthermore, she harbored some resentment towards Haruna. See, Haruna is a very shrewd and successful business executive, and for a woman to be in and maintain that position in Japan, she had to have lady balls of steel. Consequently, she's a very cold woman who doesn't really express her emotions. She's not a malicious person, but a far cry from the warm, motherly type of woman Senu was before she lost her head. Nemu had gotten it into her mind that Haruna actually resented her because she was a symbol of her father's betrayal, and in Nemu's own words, how could she truly love someone not of her blood? Now here's the thing I find very intriguing about this. Her initial concerns, while ultimately not valid, are certainly not unfounded. Haruna's cold demeanor can easily be mistaken as callousness, and it's not hard to see where such a miscommunication could have been made. Furthermore, the fact that Nemu and Haruna are not blood relatives is circumstantial evidence as to why Haruna might resent Nemu. Again, it's not true in the slightest, but you can see the threads of logic, and these are thoughts that I can imagine many children in Nemu's position would have at least entertained at some point. But the thing is that Nemu's own mental illness, while still in its early stages, exacerbated these concerns and amplified all supporting evidence in her mind. As far as she was concerned, Haruna did not care for her in any way as a person, and nothing was going to change that opinion. I really like that. In stories about mental illness, you can often see realities that are entirely constructed in someone's mind, where nothing actually connects to the real world. And while it's far from unique to Shining Song Star Nova, Nemu's false sense of reality comes from an anchor actually based in the real world, and it just grew from there. It made me really think when I read it, and I fucking love that shit. As you've probably guessed, Nemu's mental illness gets worse as the story progresses. So what brought it on? Why is it now that things start to take a downward spiral? For Senu, it was the sudden loss of a career that she clearly adored that set the stage for her fall. With Nemu, I think it comes down to a warped sense of protectiveness. See, while Nemu had a comfortable upbringing, she never really had a functional family dynamic. Her mother had to be committed while Nemu was still a toddler. Her father was very caring, but he was often preoccupied with running his business, so he couldn't always really be there for her. And of course, there was that rift between her and Haruna. However, now, she came to view Star Nova as a facsimile of family. She, the other 6 girls, and the producer collectively worked to bring this underdog group of idols into a highly successful unit, and she genuinely cared about them and about the group. And like a yandere can get obsessive over a love interest, she got highly protective of it. Even in the other routes where her mental illness is played up as a crazy yandere gag. Wow, saying that out loud makes it sound so much worse than it actually is. But even then, she most commonly slips into yandere mode when the group or someone connected to it is threatened, and that's a nice little touch. And I do want to make something clear. Based on how she acts in her story, I do think that her genuine care for her teammates is the catalyst for her protectiveness over the group. However, the violent outbursts seem to indicate a protectiveness for Star Nova as a collective rather than for any of the individual members. This is shown in Nemu's bad ending where she straight up fucking kills Mika, but it also shows in how she treated a side character named Kaori. Okay, so I made a deliberate choice to mostly exclude side characters and subplots from this video just to not bog it down, because it's already gonna be a beefy motherfucker. But Kaori is important to Nemu's story. Kaori features in multiple routes as the rank 5 girl of Quasar, a fairly timid and kind girl who is obviously very talented to have risen so high in the ranks of the top idol group in the country. Basically, in such a cutthroat group, she's a good noodle. Now, in Nemu's route, Kaori's father is indicted for a variety of white-collar crimes. Now here's a few things you should know about Japan because it's very relevant to the story. Firstly, their justice system has a more than 99% conviction rate, so when someone is charged with a crime there, it's pretty much a given that they're being punished. Secondly, in the idol world, a scandal can completely destroy careers. It's weird for me to even imagine that considering I live in the US, where the rule of thumb is that there is no bad press. I mean shit, whenever a celebrity's sex tape or nudes leak, they do some stupid shit or they piss someone off on Twitter, popularity surges. It's crazy to think that in Japan, an idol's father getting arrested can ruin her career when here in the States, the general attitude would be, why the fuck should I care? So Kaori's future wasn't looking great, but Starnova's producer saw an opportunity. He had a meeting with Kamijo and they came to an agreement. Starnova was to buy out Kaori's contract for a significant discount. Quasar was able to recoup something from an idol they could no longer utilize, and Starnova, who already had a reputation for building up fallen idols, gained one of the most skilled performers in the country for a fraction of the price. Despite the ongoing rivalry between the groups, this was a highly favorable exchange for everyone. But Nemu didn't quite see it this way, and it wasn't helped by the fact that her delusions and mental state had been slowly worsening. At this point, she was convinced that Haruna was plotting the downfall of Starnova and even hallucinated her and Kamijo meeting up and conspiring to that end. And then all of a sudden, one of Quasar's girls shows up in the practice hall? No, that isn't right. She's a mole sent to destroy Starnova from the inside, and by sheer coincidence, the media was just beginning to find out about Nemu's true parentage, resulting in some difficulties for Starnova's PR. Furthermore, Nemu's repressed memories started to come back, but not quite as they actually happened. Instead of remembering Senu trying to murder her and Haruna, she recalled Haruna murdering Senu and stealing Nemu. At this point, she knew that Haruna was her enemy and Kaori was no friend, but she couldn't voice her concerns out loud. The deal made too much sense on paper. Nobody would believe her, so she decided to bide her time, but as luck would have it, she's asked to take Kaori to the office to get her a uniform. And as the new recruit was climbing a stepladder to reach the box of spare uniforms, Nemu's illness, which she referred to as the demon, took over completely for the first time. Where her other episodes were simple flashes of rage, Nemu was completely out of her own control. So she pushes Kaori over, breaking her ankle in the process. Now that the demon was in control, it would protect her and eliminate anyone who would dare threaten Starnova. So after Kaori was taken away to the hospital, Nemu, or well, the demon within Nemu, set its sights on Haruna. Again, I'm not going to say if this is a good portrayal of a psychotic break, but in terms of storytelling, I absolutely love it. You can see Nemu getting progressively worse. She gets more paranoid, more violent, she dissociates more frequently and for longer periods of time, and it all culminates when she finally decides to seriously hurt someone. Once she finally crossed that line of actually doing harm, it was all over. She finally surrendered both literally and metaphorically, and that's pretty neat. So of course, things have to change, and change fast if bad stuff is to be avoided. And I mean, in the bad ending, she does go full yandere, ultimately killing 3 people and herself. But in the canon route, the producer, concerned by these developments, had met up with Haruna, who told him the entire story of Nemu's childhood and disclosed the fact that she was mentally ill. This was highly fortunate for Haruna because it meant that the producer was able to stop Nemu from killing her in a fit of rage, and the shock of seeing the producer jump in front of her snapped her back into lucidity. At this point, Haruna told her the whole story. The story of Senu's mental breakdown, and this time she had the producer, a man who Nemu trusted entirely to back her up, even going so far as to prove that the meeting Nemu had witnessed between Haruna and Kamijo was not physically possible. So at this point, the cognitive dissonance was so great and her false reality was being systematically dismantled, and she finally started accepting the actual facts. As you might imagine, Nemu felt like absolute shit about everything. She treated Haruna so poorly, hurt a fellow performer, and almost murdered the fuck out of a couple people. But she realizes that Haruna does actually care and always has. So we see proud, confident, controlled Nemu bow down and beg for her stepmother's forgiveness. And it's a pretty heartwarming moment. All the crap came to a head, but the stage has been set for them to heal. So Haruna does something she feels is long overdue. She takes Nemu to visit her birth mother. Modern-day Senu is a little bit uneasy. She's not been violent in many years, but her grasp of reality is even worse than it was when she was with Nemu. She did not even remember being a mother. In her mind, she was a young girl aspiring to be an idol, and Nemu was the center of a popular idol group coming to visit her in the hospital. And the really sad thing about it is that this woman represents the possible endpoint for Nemu. If things don't change, this is very well how she could end up. But now that everyone's in a bit of a better place, steps can be taken and a healthy family bond can form. And I truly do believe that a solid support network can do wonders for anyone's mental state. So now that Nemu had her bubble completely broken, she has a heart-to-heart with the producer where she really fully feels the shame and guilt for how she hurt Kaori. And the producer says something that I honestly didn't expect. A very nuanced take that you normally wouldn't see from a story like this. He doesn't blame her. How could he? She wasn't in control of herself, but he still holds her accountable for her actions. He tells her that it wasn't truly her fault any more than the mental illness itself was her fault, but she still has to make things right and she owes Kaori a sincere apology. I really do like this. A lot of the discussion I've seen surrounding mental illness ultimately tries to excuse or downplay the actions of the mentally ill, even when they hurt others. I think that's just an unfortunate side effect of people wanting to be sympathetic, but at the same time, it's just not good to accept toxic behavior, even if it's coming from a place of mental illness. The concept of supporting Nemu and understanding her while also making sure she bears responsibility for the things she did is an incredibly mature position, and I respect the fuck out of it. So Nemu gives a groveling apology, and Kaori, being the absolute sweetheart that she is, completely forgives her. And now that Nemu's immediate loose ends are tied up, she's ready to put on Starnova's next big performance. So while that's happening, the mental hospital Senu is at does something very stupid. They decide to let her watch her daughter perform on TV. Why the fuck would they do this? Sure, she might not have been violent in a long time, but idols are a known trigger for her worst symptoms. The idea that any reputable mental health professional would allow Senu to watch a fucking idol performance unsupervised is absolutely ridiculous. Of fucking course she saw Starnova on TV and had a break. She ends up convincing herself that Nemu is a body double sent to replace Senu and steal her spotlight. So naturally, she grabs a saw and sneaks out to go deal with her. Haruna was also making her way to the performance. Despite being a busy woman, the recent developments had flared up that motherly love and goddammit she was going to support Nemu, her daughter, at her big performance. She fortunately arrives just in time to stop Senu and after a brief struggle takes the weapon and pins her to the ground. Her next words say it all. That was the strength of a mother. At this point, Senu realizes what she almost did, that she almost killed her daughter, and just breaks down. And Haruna goes to her and tells her that she loves Nemu as her own and pleads with Senu to please get better for Nemu's sake. I mean shit, this is the most emotion we've ever seen from the Ice Queen Haruna, and it's really touching. And at that moment, Starnova's song ends and Nemu addresses the crowd. She tells them that yes, she is the product of an affair, but it's the woman who raised her that she truly views as her mother. And when she says the words, "Haruna, I'm sorry, I love you, as your only daughter," she starts tearing up, only getting more emotional from there. It was a really beautiful conclusion to all the emotional buildup happening in this final arc of Nemu's story, and you're goddamn right that this was my tear-up moment right here. Now, I personally think that while it wouldn't have been the best choice, the story could have ended right here. It was a solid conclusion. But there was still a decent bit to go in the story, and it was mostly dedicated to tying up loose ends. It shows that Starnova is still going strong, that Nemu pulled some strings and took a massive loan from Haruna to get Kaori the best medical treatment available, and fortunately, she made a full recovery, and she finally joined Starnova as they had originally planned. Nemu then decided to enter the business world so she could work to pay back her debt. That's a really nice way of doing things. It's like the rest of her career is a big redemption arc, and she was able to right all her wrongs. And Senu began her own path to recovery too. The sudden realizations that came about at the performance seemed to have much the same effect as Nemu in snapping her out of her immediate delusions, and she's shown to have a cordial relationship with both Nemu and Haruna. They make it clear that she's still got a lot of work to do, but she's in a better place. And Nemu herself, having now a strong support network, slowly began to beat back her own demons until one day they completely retreated, never to be seen again. A bit of a storybook ending, but it's thematically consistent. I think Nemu's story is great. I've always loved seeing classic tropes and cliches be completely subverted, and utilizing the yandere archetype to have a story about mental illness is exactly the kind of thing I find fascinating. The one thing that's a little disappointing is how in the common route and in the other routes, her mental illness is basically turned into a joke. To be clear, I don't mind the fact that there is a joke where she just grabs a knife and goes psycho at the drop of a hat, but going back and seeing that after having experienced a serious story about mental illness seems somewhat in poor taste. That being said, it's overall a very minor issue in an otherwise great story. The tsundere is one of the most well-known and popular character archetypes in anime. For those of you not in the know, a tsundere is a character who has romantic feelings for another but tries to hide that fact by indignantly and unconvincingly denying it. The tsundere can basically be summed up by the following phrase: "Baka, it's not like I like you or anything." And yes, that at the end is 100% necessary. Tsunderes in their various forms are incredibly common, but here's the thing, I typically don't like them. I'm of the firm belief that the tsundere is never best girl. What, I'm supposed to be into the girl whose defining character trait is that she acts like a bitch all the time? In any case, Julie is a very interesting take on the tsundere archetype, and it's used to then pivot into much deeper themes as the story goes on. Julie is half Japanese, half American, having lived in both countries as a child due to the fact that her father was in the US Navy. She has the most aggressive and confrontational personality of the group, and to call her bullheaded would be an understatement. She does pretty much whatever she wants and doesn't have the greatest control over her anger. So for most of the plot points in Julie's story to make sense, I do have to reiterate something I touched on earlier. In Japan, scandals can ruin entertainment careers, and that's a big factor driving conflict in Julie's route. Again, here in the US, controlling the public's attention, regardless whether that attention is positive or negative, is a career goldmine. In Japan, reputation and honor are a really big deal, but as you might imagine, this does not bode well for the rather raucous Julie. Julie's bitchiness and rebellious nature are down to her underlying issues with abandonment. This is the kind of thing that I'd normally give some context for beforehand, but as I mentioned, Shining Song Star Nova is about as subtle as a brick at times, and it's made pretty abundantly clear in literally the first conversation of her route, where she literally says, "You're not going to abandon me, are you?" So yeah, abandonment issues. In any case, Julie's aggressive actions are a lot like Aki's aggressive personality. It's a defense mechanism. If she has the freedom and the ability to fuck things up, then she's always in control. She doesn't need to rely on anyone if she's in control. And this is actually realistic from a psychological perspective, and you see it a lot in children who have suffered abuse. Abused children will sometimes become bullies or will rebel against authority in school because it gives them a sense of control that they didn't have in their home life. Julie's issues stem from a home life that isn't all that bad or even particularly uncommon, but still not the healthiest to be sure. Her parents had a very rocky marriage and would fight a lot, so she acted out, dressed provocatively, and got into trouble with the delinquents at school. This was the root of her tendency to rebel, and honestly, it seems perfectly natural. But then, her parents finally split up in a messy divorce where her mother took her back to Japan. From what I can tell, her father was never outright abusive, but Julie only ever really talked about how he fought with her mother, and he also never tried to maintain contact with Julie after the split. So not the worst person in the world, but still a deadbeat dad. In addition to general bitchiness and acts of rebellion, Julie spends a lot of the beginning part of her route trying to aggressively seduce the producer. I think this ties into both of her big issues at the same time, those being control and abandonment. On the abandonment side of things, she views the producer as a good-hearted, reliable person, and that's something she naturally gravitates towards. Plus, she straight up says as much. Again, subtlety, brick. You know the deal. The only real male authority figure she's ever had in her life was her flaky father, so having a strong, reliable one in the producer gives her a massive lady boner. On the control side of things, there's a few interesting facets to it. Firstly, there's the persistent idea that if she fucks things up by being reckless, she's still in control, so it doesn't matter. So she's willing to take risks and potentially screw up her reputation as long as she does it on her terms. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, the idol industry can be sleazy, so being a producer-seducer can have positive effects for your career. That being said, this completely backfires. See, because the producer is actually a good dude who wants to do right by Star Nova, he shoots her down. So what starts out as a ploy for control in her life ends up revealing that she has even less control, which really pisses her off, leading to bigger acts of rebellion as the story progresses. I actually really like that. It's a neat way to exacerbate her issues to the point that they cause problems, but it does so in a very natural manner and a way that's consistent with everyone's character. Another really neat thing about Julie is again how she plays the tsundere. Of course, the actual anime archetype she puts on is just a stage persona. In private, she's almost the exact opposite in terms of how she actually acts. Where a traditional tsundere tries to deny any degree of attraction, Julie aggressively pursues the object of her affection, consequences be damned. However, it seems to stem from the exact same underlying cause that fuels most tsunderes, putting on a tough outer persona to cover up any and all emotional vulnerability and to maintain a degree of control. It's pretty cool how it works out like that. So Julie's attempts at seduction fail miserably, like she's even got her tits up in the producer's face and he still rejects her. She's not used to not getting her way like that, so she decides to rebel in other ways. Her first scandal was when she decided to go commando for a performance and the tabloids got a blurry picture of her ass. Again, this is something that would be great here in America, but it caused problems for Star Nova, and as you might imagine, the producer was kinda pissed because she just basically gave him a bunch of extra work since he now has to do damage control. But an interesting thing happened. The scandal actually ended up working out for Star Nova like it would in the West. The story got Star Nova's name into a lot of mouths and sales boomed. On top of that, because the photo of Julie's ass was very blurry, the group could still officially deny it. The record label loved that shit, and they pushed the producer into marketing the group on its sex appeal, which makes sense to me. I'm guessing that the buzz generated by the rumors plus the plausible deniability from the studio made it so the positives of the attention offset any negatives from the scandal. Now, while this was good for Star Nova, you have to remember that Julie was just rewarded for her bad behavior. This is not a good thing because it only bolsters her confidence to do even stupider shit in the future. So Star Nova kinda coasts on this for a bit. Julie keeps doing Julie things, though nothing too serious. She also starts showing some genuine care and affection, slowly growing closer to the producer, and he actually starts to catch feels. Eventually he's just like, shit, if this keeps this up, I'm actually gonna fuck her, and that would be very bad. So he pulls some strings and announces that he's gonna be transferring away from Star Nova to a different unit, and the girls would be getting a new producer. Now, to the producer, he was doing the right thing and was acting in the best interest of the girls because he realized that the romantic feelings and sexual tension between him and Julie could cause serious issues. So in his mind, extracting himself from the situation was the best solution and the selfless solution, and everyone would be better off for it, even though he very much enjoyed working with Star Nova. However, Julie didn't see it that way. In her eyes, he was doing the one thing she couldn't emotionally handle. He was abandoning her. So she completely loses her shit, and in her emotional state, she gets hammered at the nearest bar and basically drags this musician into a love hotel, which are basically paid fuck shacks that exist in Japan. The tabloids all got wind of what she did, photos and everything, but this wasn't like the last time where they could leverage the bad press into positive results. This time, shit was fucked to the point where Star Nova's future was uncertain, and the producer was absolutely furious, and what happened next was such an interesting read. So the producer is yelling at Julie, and he's only getting more and more agitated. This is unusual for him, but this was a very high-stress situation, and Julie had been very difficult to work with in general, so it made sense. So he's admonishing her not just for being reckless, but screwing over her teammates and the singer she pulled into the love hotel. I mean, she potentially screwed up 8 people's careers plus her own with that outburst. Interestingly, the producer is going through almost the same thing that Julie went through. He lost all control of the situation and was taking it out on Julie because that was all he could do. I know this because the narration explicitly states this. For fuck's sake. And at this moment, all she can say is, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, over and over again, frantically. She breaks down, damn near having a panic attack. I got actual chills reading this. When she starts freaking out and apologizing over and over, all I could think was, oh fuck. She went from domineering to meek and submissive just like that, and that tells me there's emotional damage there. I said earlier that the producer was basically the only male authority figure that Julie respected, and I think that in a sense, he took on a bit of a warped parental role in her mind. She was always trying to push his buttons, but once she pushed him far enough to actually make him angry, she backed off and became fearful and vulnerable, which is something we hadn't seen a single time up until this point. Not once. She also got, let's just say she was kind of aroused at this point. And of course, this led to a spanking scene. Basically, all the rage and sexual tension boiled over, and the producer just kinda goes to town, and Julie is very clearly into it. Perhaps not in the best taste, but it definitely nails the point that Julie has a bit of a masochistic streak, which potentially explains some of her recklessness. If she derives some satisfaction from negative attention, it makes sense that she's constantly willing to risk fucking things up. After the H scene, everyone calms down. As much as the interaction was not healthy in the slightest, seriously people, don't ever hit someone out of anger, but it was cathartic. Once the emotions were all done peaking, they were able to regain their heads and interact more rationally than before. This is pretty realistic as well. I can't exactly relate to the, well, it wasn't hate fucking, but hate foreplay, I guess. But after a big blow-up fight, assuming it doesn't stem from anger issues, you usually calm down, and actually you can sometimes feel better because those emotions aren't bottled up anymore. So at this point, the producer calmly explains that there's no point in still being upset, but he's gonna disband Star Nova. But as it turns out, while Julie tried to fuck the singer, he completely shot her down and lectured her about how irresponsible she was being, which I find weirdly amusing. But as she's talking, explaining the whole thing, we see another first. She genuinely regrets what she did. After leaving the hotel, she felt relieved that nothing actually happened, like she had a second chance. But when the tabloids started tabloiding, that relief turned to dread. She thought she'd barely avoided screwing everyone over, but she still messed up, and that hit her hard. But the producer, having learned that the story was actually false, had a renewed hope and doubled down on the group, vowing to do his best to fix things. This experience was ultimately very humbling, and from this point on, you can see a remarkable change in Julie's character. She's still the same person, but a lot less aggressive and stupid than before. She even asks the producer to remove her as the center because that would be what's best for the unit, which shows a really significant level of growth and maturity, but as luck would have it, that was entirely unnecessary. It turns out that the singer, a kid by the name of Kyle, is gay. So with a strategically placed announcement in Star Nova's press conference, they were able to deflect the major career-ending scandal, and instead issued an apology for the lesser, Julie got shit-faced at a bar scandal. I'm not a huge fan of protagonists getting out of tough situations due to luck like that, but I'm actually able to overlook it because this was just the setup for the real story. While this whole thing was its own story arc in itself, it really just set up the baseline for what's to come, and it was able to bring Julie from her tropey kind of persona to a more human and sympathetic one. So while their reputation took a hit, Star Nova had a fighting chance, and they went all in prepping a big comeback performance. Unfortunately, something horrific happened at one of their PR events. A crazed fan pulled out a knife, screamed, "Watanabe Julie is a whore," and attacked, cutting Julie on the palms of her hands and also mildly injuring Aki and the producer, who both rushed to her defense. Everyone's injuries were minor and they all healed in no time, but Julie sustained more than just physical wounds. The attack really affected her. When the producer went to visit her for the first time in the hospital, she'd actually regressed into childhood and addressed him as Papa. That's pretty fucking dark, and it gave me another oh fuck moment. Age regression is another thing that's very real, and it's some serious shit. It's another defense mechanism to protect against trauma, and that's the thing. Where Nemu's story was one of mental illness, Julie's story is one of trauma. The attack fucked her up, and her existing emotional issues certainly didn't help. Furthermore, the attack was essentially another scandal for Starnova at a time when they couldn't afford it. Again, as an American, it's hard to even conceptualize this because over here, Julie could have expected an incredible level of support. When someone is blatantly victimized like that, we tend to rally behind them. But this story is set in Japan, not the US, so it's negatively affecting the group, which is just another stressor for Julie. Starnova still had its dedicated fans, so their fan club, led by two guys named Kyosuke and Junpei, decide to make a fan cover of their debut song to cheer everyone up. As an aside, I'm kinda sad that I decided not to go into side characters for this video because I just love Kyosuke and Junpei. They are the most lovable simps. But anyway, the producer's been working overtime to try to fix things, and he decides to show Julie because it was kinda funny and he figured she'd enjoy it. Well, as soon as they start singing, Julie has a full-on panic attack. Having people turn on her like they did kind of warped her mentality so that she saw signs of support as fuel for the hatred that she felt was inevitable. Of course, she explicitly states this in the dialogue, but before the lack of subtlety could really piss me off, she says 8 words that were probably the most impactful phrase of the entire visual novel for me. I'm scared. I'm scared. Please protect me, Papa. That adds a whole new level of oh shit to the equation. Julie suffered some pretty severe emotional trauma. I'm not comfortable labeling it full-on PTSD, but she suffered the kind of hurt that doesn't just go away. And fan adoration is a trigger for her. Bad enough to make her regress. Even if Starnova can weather the storm caused by the attack, it's clear that Julie is in no condition to perform, and it's not clear if she'll ever be. This whole situation, seeing Julie completely broken, hurt the producer as well. Remember, he's an idealist. He joined the industry because he loved the spectacle, the hope and perfection that idols were supposed to represent. Seeing someone he cared about so broken and destroyed by the industry he loved shook him to his core, and he's just like, I can't do this anymore. I can't put anyone else through this level of hurt. So he and Julie, both completely disenfranchised at this point, decide to run away, to take a train and get off at the last stop. After all, Julie couldn't perform, and the producer no longer wanted to produce. And besides, with the craziness happening, their hands would have been tied even if they were in top shape. So with nothing to lose, they fuck off for a bit. The producer does let the others know what's going on because, as he explicitly states in the narration, he's not quite ready to cut off all his ties to his old life. What follows is a really sweet and wholesome section where the two live in a rural inn almost like husband and wife. They spend their days exploring the area and enjoying each other's company. And we see a very different side to Julie. All the shit she'd been through completely broke down her defenses, so she wasn't that bitchy rebel from before. What we see instead is a happy and surprisingly loving person. She's also shown to be quite hungry for love and affection, which is interesting when you consider that her big trigger is adoration. But now that she's completely extracted from the world of idols with someone she trusts completely, that she feels comfortable being vulnerable around, she showed drastic improvement. She was happy, she was functional, and by all accounts was doing pretty well. She was not fixed though. She has nightmares, she still exhibits self-doubt, she's still fragile. But without the stressors of her old life, she's improving. And that's really the best case scenario. After a very happy month together, the two share a grandiose Christmas dinner that Julie went through a lot of hassle to prepare. It was a lovely day, but Julie then decided that the producer would get his true gift. See, the two were happy. They enjoyed each other's company immensely, and it was very therapeutic to get away from their old life for a bit. But the producer always had this tiny twinge of doubt in the back of his mind. While he was determined to enjoy the moment, he knew that it wasn't going to last forever. Sooner or later, they'd have to make a change one way or another. And besides, seeing Julie's recovery helped him let go of that hatred he felt for his profession, and a part of him still wanted to achieve greatness, to leave his mark on the world, to carve a legacy of cheers and glory. And Julie isn't stupid. She was with this dude pretty much 24/7 for an entire month, and she picked up on that. So she tells him that he's free to make that request he really wants to make, and she'll go with him. And man, he fucking wants it. And as much as he appreciated his time with Julie, he knew that if he left everything behind, there'd always be a bit of doubt. So Julie extends the offer to go back and rebuild Starnova from the ground up together, and I have to say, this scene right here is why I fucking love character-driven storytelling. When characters and their interactions are built up and explored, a great story can happen at any time as long as you have these characters, and simple moments can become profound. The past month was literally the happiest Julie had ever been in her life, by her own words. And with a few words, she offers to leave that all behind and go back to the life that caused her so much pain and suffering that damn near broke her beyond repair. And it was one of the most genuine moments of pure selflessness in the entire visual novel. And remember, not too long ago, she was the bitchy, self-absorbed tsundere. Though she's gone through some terrible times, she grew as a person, and even as a reader, I was super proud of her. So they return home. There's a tearful reunion and some serious strategizing. The media and fan outrage had all pretty much died down, and the record label would be willing to let them perform if they can show themselves to be an asset. But Julie still held some doubts, and it's gonna sound weird for me to say it, but I'm glad she did. I think a lot of writers would have basically fixed Julie at this point, and upon returning to Star Nova, she'd be better than ever. But Julie is still scared, and though her wounds had healed substantially, they hadn't completely closed. She still feels a visceral dread at the thought of performing. She's scared, but she decides to face her fears head on. She pops in that video from the Star Nova fan club, you know, the lovable simps, and decides to actually finish it this time. The men start singing, and Julie has another panic attack. She drops to the floor, crying and hyperventilating. But there's one big difference this time. She's still lucid. The last time she saw this video, she completely broke down and regressed into childhood. This time, she was still freaking out, but she kept her head. And she was able to make it through the entire thing, and at the end, you know what she did? She fucking smiled. Those nerds had gone out of their way to cheer her up, and at the end of the day, she appreciated it. As much as this whole situation does leave her and the producer with some worry, she just crossed a major hurdle. So the girls have a big mutual pep talk where they get excited to make their comeback, and Julie accepts the others as shoulders she can lean on so they can perform as a unit together. And they'll really fucking need to be on their A game because the only way the producer was able to convince the record label to let them perform was to book them at a big boy arena. If they blow everyone away, they get their rebirth. Fail, and the label will sell their girls' contracts off to Quasar. It was a desperate gambit, but the only way to potentially prevent the deal from going through. And the one question on everyone's mind, is Julie ready? The night of the performance arrives and the house is packed. The girls take the stage, the music plays, and they're faced with the roar of the crowd. Muscle memory takes over, and initially, things are going well. But then Julie tightens up. She was not fucking ready one bit. Anxiety grips her, and she finds herself unable to even do the backup routines they developed just in case. She starts panicking. Once more, she sees that man and his knife in front of her. Watanabe Julie is a whore. She trips and falls, and everything stops. It was their one big chance to make a comeback, and she just fucked it up. But then, something strange happened. Some words were forming from the crowd, a chant that grew louder and louder until every voice in the arena was calling out in unison. On your feet. On your feet. On your feet. She messed up, but the crowd was still on her side. They still wanted her to succeed. They did not abandon her in her darkest moment. So she stood up, brushed herself off, and got ready to perform. And she fucking killed it. Julie's route might be my favorite show of character development in Shining Song Star Nova. Certainly, she's the one who grew the most from beginning to end. I definitely appreciate the fact that she wasn't just a typical tsundere, which as I mentioned before, is not an archetype I like. Her route also has a really brutal examination of trauma and self-loathing. I mean, it was a pretty bold choice to have circumstance just consistently beat the shit out of her, even as she grew as a person. It gave the story a real trial by fire kind of feeling, and I really liked that. I do think she healed a bit too fast to be realistic. Look, I think it makes a lot of sense that even though she was in a better place by the time the performance came around, she still panicked. And no doubt it was wholesome as fuck when the crowd started chanting for her. But even though this would have been an excellent breakthrough moment that sets up future healing, I don't think she'd have been able to just stand up and give that epic performance. It's definitely a nice storybook ending, but it seems kind of out of place in a story like Shining Song Star Nova. Still, it's a very, very minor gripe. Ultimately, the setup was all there, and it was all really good. It's just that the final payoff seemed a tiny bit rushed. I'm honestly not sure how they could have been adjusted without significantly changing up the structure of the final act. After all, the plot kind of led to a situation where the breakthrough necessarily came at the final performance where she obviously needed to succeed. Still, I overall really enjoyed Julie's route. I don't think it quite beats out Aki's, but it's definitely up there. Sasami is not the most interesting character on a surface level, and honestly, in the other routes, she kinda blends into the background. She plays the sweet, wholesome, build everyone up kind of performer, and unlike the others, her stage persona is actually quite reflective of her actual personality. She does get a bit more interesting once we take a deeper look into her route, but that's the thing. You obviously don't get that deeper look until you play her route, so in the time leading up to it, I wasn't particularly excited because I didn't particularly care about her as a character. The reason I'm bringing this up is twofold. Firstly, I just want to emphasize that Sasami's route has a good amount of weight to pull due to the fact that she wasn't really all that endearing as a side character. Secondly, it was given further pressure due to how Shining Song Star Nova is structured. Sasame's route is the closest that Shining Song Star Nova has to a true route. Some visual novels have branching storylines, but they're pretty clear that only one is actually canonical. And officially, according to Love and Space, there is no one canon route in Shining Song Star Nova. However, I'm not so sure that's true. Way back at the beginning of the video, I said that to choose a route, you pick which girl is going to be the center of the unit. Well, Sasame's route is actually blocked off until you've gone through the other 6. Whether or not this is meant to make Sasame's route the true route, what I can tell you is that it ties together a lot of the story elements of other routes, including things like Nemu's mental illness and Aki's toxic relationship with her mother. If it isn't meant to be a true route, my guess is that they still wanted to be able to tie everything together, but also wanted to ensure that they didn't spoil anything. Now, when it comes to visual novels wanting to tie all their various storylines together into a single route, particularly stories where romance is a defining characteristic, there's 2 realistic options. Firstly, some will offer a harem route where you don't just get the girl, you get all the girls. I think that wouldn't really fit into a story like Shining Song Star Nova. The second option is to pick a girl and artificially give her route more importance. And that's the route that Love and Space took, and the girl they chose was Sasami. So the first thing I want to mention about Sasame's route is that a lot of the issues that took center stage in the other routes are resolved at some point, typically in an offhand way. This actually addresses an admittedly minor issue I have with a lot of dynamic visual novels that delve into deeper, darker territory. Oftentimes it seems like the journey you go on with one character in their route is instrumental in helping them overcome their obstacles, and they were in deep shit without it. Now on its face, that's perfectly fine, it gives the story some weight. However, it implies that when you take a different girl's route, the first character will end up in a terrible situation because they don't get to go on that big emotional journey. It's one of those things where you kind of have to just pretend that it's not a factor. Sasame's route actually fixing these various issues, even if some of them feel like a cop-out, helps with that. Though at the same time, the routes are so fundamentally different just from a what happens in the world around them sense that I'm able to maintain that suspension of disbelief regardless. I mean, in different routes, different things happen independent of Star Nova, so it's not a strict instance of what if this girl was the center, but an entirely different timeline. But regardless, Nemu and Haruna have that important talk. Aki and her mother come to an understanding and mend their relationship, though the details are never revealed. Julie and Mika don't have to deal with the same level of targeted negativity that they do in their routes, so they're just fine. And Natsuki is able to successfully crowdfund to save the farm. Oh, and did I mention that in Sasame's route, Star Nova blows the fuck up? Like, after their initial hit, the successes just keep rolling in, and they were among the top idol groups before they even knew it, leading to a lot more money, fame, and all the craziness that accompanies it. So after the introduction where it's explained how everything went super well, there's an immediate segment where the producer is accompanying Sasami on her various idol-related jobs, such as photo shoots, commercials, stuff like that. This is to highlight a day in their new life, and 2 things stand out. Firstly, everything is super busy. As big-name celebrities, the girls have their schedules completely packed most of the time, and the producer is constantly juggling 10 different things at once. Secondly, it's the introduction to the idea that success changes people. That's a very real thing. Some people, or actually I'd argue most people, act differently when they go through a significant positive change in their life. Sometimes it's a good change, like a well-meaning troublemaker I knew in high school. He joined the army and is now a surprisingly responsible, put-together person. Sometimes the change is negative. Ever have a coworker get promoted and all of a sudden they turn into a complete asshole? Well, the producer changed when Star Nova became popular. While his core identity is the same, he went from being this idealistic nerd to a bit of a dick. But only a bit, and he's certainly not malicious. But he's more than willing to rudely bark orders at the people around him when he wants something done. He's become increasingly intolerant of imperfect work around his idols. Again, he's not a sadist or anything. He doesn't enjoy putting people down. He's just developed a laser focus on providing the best of everything to his talent, to the point where he can be a bit of a dick about it. But it's also made clear, in the narration, that his heart is still in the right place. He's doing what he's doing for the sake of his idols. His mentality essentially boils down to, my newfound wealth is really nice, but I have a responsibility to my girls. If I don't do everything in my power to be the best producer possible, I'm no better than a leech. So while he is becoming a bit of a douche, he's still clearly someone the reader is meant to like. Now this whole situation is a little concerning to Sasami. After all, let's not forget that our entire perception of her is just this kind-hearted girl who wants everyone to be happy and nice to each other. So she doesn't really like the changes she sees in the producer and the group as a whole, but while the rest of the girls sympathize and in some ways agree with her, they also all kind of accept that with this level of success comes a necessary step towards professionalism rather than their old familial way of doing things. They also encourage Sasami to view all the management, including the producer who had gotten them this far, as business partners, not friends. Sasami ultimately kind of drops this argument, but she doesn't really accept defeat. After all, she has the producer on a bit of a pedestal. Oh, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. See, way back towards the beginning of Shining Song Star Nova, there was an event that I neglected to mention. As it turns out, Maria and Aki weren't the only members of Star Nova to have worked with Golden Calf in the past. The producer and Sasami also worked there for a time, though none of them ever worked together. Well, the reason neither of them still work there is that the producer, by pure chance, happened to walk in on some management executive getting just a little bit rapey with Sasami. So this absolute Chad goes and punches the dude in the face, ultimately leading to both both of them getting fired. I mean, let's be honest, a corrupt corporation like Golden Calf would obviously side with a high-level executive over a low-level talent and a pencil pusher. So Sasami from the start held a lot of gratitude and respect for the producer, and in a sense, just by being a decent person who was against the sleaziness of the industry, he helped fuel her idealism for idling, which is why her negative experience didn't really affect her in the same way as Maria's or Aki's. But still, despite the fact that she was overall in a very good place, her idealism was starting to wear down just a bit due to the changes in the producer and in her teammates. So now let's fast forward a bit. The producer manages to land Sasami a leading role in a big budget feature film, namely Lord Gilla, which is just the copyright saved version of Godzilla. The only catch, if you can even really call it that, is that she'll be sharing the spotlight with Shiro Okida, the center of Quasar. Ultimately, it's good press for everyone involved, and landing that role is huge for Sasami's name recognition. Now, despite the producer's concerns, when filming starts, Shiro is on her best behavior and initially proves to be no trouble whatsoever, even going so far as to offer pointers to the inexperienced Sasami. So the producer turns his ire towards Sasami's on-set assistant, who is not the most desirable co-worker. He's not evil or anything, but he isn't great at his job and has a pretty bad attitude. So Sasami and Shiro end up becoming fairly friendly as they share quite a few scenes, and Shiro takes the opportunity to mentor Sasami. But here's the thing, Shiro is a manipulator, and on top of that, her history has led her to forcibly suppress her own emotions and morality. So she's not doing this out of the goodness of her heart. Rather, as explained through fucking dialogue, her goal is to get friendly with Sasami before stabbing her in the back, much like she did with Kana all those years ago. Basically, she wants to traumatize Sasami enough that she, and by extension Starnova as a whole, cease to be a threat at the Idol Grand Prix. Now, Sasami is very trusting and always tries to see the good in people, which normally is a positive trait, but she's trusting to the point where she can be blind to the bad in people. And let's be real here, Shiro's got more red flags than a college student who read 3 pages of Marx and thinks they're suddenly an economic prodigy, but Sasami sees none of that. So it takes Shiro very little effort to suss out some of her fears and concerns, such as her crush on the producer, her extreme passivity, and the fact that she's very sexually inhibited, like to the point where she's uncomfortable about an upcoming kiss scene. So she slowly starts planning ideas in Sasami's head. Act out a bit to get the producer's attention. Make him notice you. That's how it started. A little mischievous perhaps, but nothing awful. But she slowly makes moves to make her more and more entitled, less considerate of others. Shiro has her cry crocodile tears more often. She has her exaggerate her fear of a creepy fan. At one point, she successfully convinces Sasami that not only is her current assistant unacceptable, but that she should falsely accuse him of groping her, resulting in a new, better assistant, and sympathy points with the producer. As this is going on, Sasami starts becoming a morally gray character. While she's still generally pleasant to be around, she becomes more self-centered and less empathetic, losing or at least lessening many of the traits that we as the reader are supposed to identify with and use as reasons to root for her. But I also think it's clever for another reason, because it's pretty transparently Shiro manipulating Sasami into being like this. Our frustrations and anger at Sasami's actions get reflected onto Shiro rather than the person actually doing these things. I think it was a very neat way to have Sasami do these morally objectionable things for selfish reasons, but still remain sympathetic as a protagonist. Also, there's a really nice dose of reality there too. Sasami is ultimately never held accountable for most of her actions during her bad streak. Many stories would have had some of these things come back to bite her in the ass, or would have at least had her come clean. But no, I mean that assistant she falsely accused gets fired and she never gets any shit for it. In fact, nobody except Sasami, the assistant himself, and Shiro ever even knew it was a lie. People in positions of power can get away with much worse with very little effort. Partly due to money, partly due to being surrounded by yes men, and partly due to their position of power making them seem more trustworthy on a psychological level. I liked it. But that's not all Shiro was doing with Sasami. She also had some more selfish objectives. If you watch the section on Maria, you've probably already guessed that Shiro had a bit of an attraction to Sasami as well. I mean, come on, if Shiro were a dinosaur, she'd be a Lickalotopus. So she starts making sexual moves on Sasami, starting with kissing and then progressing under the guise of practice, which I can't fucking believe that actually worked. Shit, Shiro uses the "it's only practice" line and gets to fool around. I use it and all I get is a restraining order. Fucking double standards, I tell you. Back on a more serious note, as much as Shiro was just bullshitting so she could get some, it actually worked for Sasami. After kissing Shiro, she became more comfortable with the kiss scene, pulling it off like it was nothing. After going a little further, she was confident enough to make a move on the producer. Shiro's influence was changing Sasami in many ways. But then things take a bit of a twist. As it turns out, Shiro's plan worked a little too well. Sasami, while somewhat naive, was never stupid. As her blinders were removed, she realized what Shiro was doing, so she took the initiative and basically kicked her to the curb, thanking her for the lessons but ending their friendship. And let me tell you, that shit was ice cold. She was giving me straight up anime villain vibes. And here she reaches her moral low point. Remember Aki's injury, the one she covered up? Well, it makes a reappearance in Sasami's route, and it threatens to keep her out of their upcoming performance at the Tokyo Dome, which to my understanding is about as big a deal as performing at Madison Square Garden is here in the US. So yeah, bad timing. At this point, the girls are a little pessimistic and lash out at each other, not out of genuine malice, but out of frustration. Normally, Sasami would be the one calming everyone down, diffusing the situation with a wave of aggressive kindness. But new Sasami just starts tearing into Maria and Julie, and it's actually Mika getting upset that finally cools everyone off. But everyone still leaves in poor spirits. So fast forward a bit and Aki's back. But of course, she's not fully healed and she's just faking it so she can perform at the Dome because it's fucking Aki. Sasami pretty quickly realizes this and tells the producer. Now, she's really doing it so she can basically take shots. After all, Aki is the one with the most potential to replace her, and she does have a point that with Aki still being injured, that poses a risk to their performance. Now, this is actually a pretty big development because for the first time, she's actually looking to bring down a teammate. But another interesting thing happens in that same conversation. Her new mask slips a bit and she reveals that the way she's been is starting to stress her the fuck out. Sometimes she's on top of the world, but other times she actually has physical reactions to the stress of living such an extreme double life where you can't trust anyone. And I mean, yeah, you can actually feel intense stress in your body and it's not a pleasant experience. Now at this point, we the audience aren't really identifying with Sasami anymore. Shiro is no longer a convenient scapegoat, and Sasami is acting like this of her own volition. Also, her tone, both in the actual words being spoken and in the voice actress's delivery, get much more ominous and dark. Like, the voice actress actually drops down an octave as Sasori becomes more corrupt. And that's pretty cool. At this point, we don't really know who we should be rooting for. Fast forward a bit more and they're at the Tokyo Dome. Their performance starts out spectacularly. However, before long, Aki's injury catches up with her mid-performance and she just cannot continue. Fortunately, after that conversation with Sasami from earlier, the producer took steps to make sure that there would be a doctor on standby just in case. So Maria stalls for time with a solo performance while they take Aki to the doctor. Now this doctor is the stereotypical sketchy underground doctor. Unclear credentials, German accent, the works. This dude's about to inject Aki with some random-ass drug to fix her knee. And by random-ass drug, I mean... Actually, let me quote from the visual novel directly. "Oh yes, totally legal. Don't worry about a thing. After all, how can the government ban something it doesn't know exists? Probably not shit you want in your body." Julie put it best when she says, "This is seriously fucked." Of course, Aki wants the drugs. She even begs the producer to give them to her, and the producer then has to make a decision which in the narration is posed as Aki or Starnova. So naturally, the good ending comes about if you choose not to give her the drugs. Aki's still trying to plead with the producer, but at this point, Sasami breaks down. Seeing the producer put Aki's well-being over their big performance finally broke through this cynical wall she'd built up, and now she was seeing Aki desperately trying to sacrifice her own health to get back on stage. And it all just washes over her. She starts crying, giving this big emotional speech which boils down to, "Your health is more important than this performance. Please don't kill yourself just to put on a good show. It doesn't matter how tonight goes as long as we're still around tomorrow." And then Aki starts crying and yep, fucking tear up moment right there. I absolutely did not do this scene justice. Sasami's speech is a couple paragraphs long and it's really well done. But man, this scene had so much build up and it led to a great payoff. As I already mentioned, we the audience were starting to lose support for Sasami as she became less of a relatable and likable character. However, we did still want to root for Starnova as a whole, and it felt bad when Aki fell. Both because we care about Aki as a character, but also because we know what a damper it'll put on their big performance. To see Sasami reject all the negativity she'd built up since first meeting Shiro felt good. While Sasami was becoming less of a character I could root for, I still wanted to see reasons to root for her. So when her genuinely empathetic personality broke through the cold veneer, things started looking up, even though the performance was kinda fucked. And the performance was fucked. While it wasn't a total disaster, Aki's injury greatly outshone the positive press they were expecting to receive. It also didn't result in the popularity boost they were relying on for the upcoming Idol Grand Prix. So it really did hurt the group, but it was overall positive because, well, the teenager didn't get injected with strange and dangerous drugs. Oh yeah, and Sasami's better now too. Fast forward a bit more, and Soma Music wants the producer to replace the entire membership of Starnova with younger, more trained girls. They give moderately understandable reasons to get rid of each girl, but it's really not a well thought out idea. Look, I get that this plot point was added to generate a third act conflict and to push the story forward, but I cannot get over how fucking stupid it is. Even in universe, it makes no goddamn sense. These businessmen actually think that replacing the entire fucking lineup of their most popular group all at once is a good idea and that there won't be any negative reception. Fans of groups like this tend to be fans of the individuals within the group, and if you completely change everything, it won't be the Starnova they know and love, and there's a good chance they may not continue to be fans. If you want to replace an entire lineup like that, which I still think is stupid, you do it one at a time and draw it out so the fans get accustomed to each change. It's like the old saying goes, throw a frog into boiling water and it'll jump out. Slowly raise the temperature and it won't. Jesus fuck, I'm not even in the entertainment industry and I know this shit. I probably shouldn't be so annoyed by this, but come the fuck on. This was so unrealistic that it completely took me out of the story for a bit. It's actually uncharacteristically lazy writing. As I said earlier, it pisses me off when something is good and I see these kinds of flaws holding it back. Anyway, the girls are on the chopping block and the producer's hands are tied. I'm also going to mention that earlier in the story, Kamijo had attempted to poach Sasami from Star Nova to be a member of Quasar. This ties into the whole subplot involving Quasar, Pedo Oda, and the internal politics of Golden Calf, but I'm not going to get into it because, well, just look at how long this video is already. But suffice it to say that Kamijo wants Sasami, and once the producer spills the beans, she actually has an incentive to seriously consider the proposition. So Sasami ends up having a conversation with Shiro, who actually does something really neat. She kind of breaks down and gives this ranty speech about how the pressure is getting to her and how she's scared that people will see through her double life. This is a really neat callback to the conversation where Sasami told the producer about Aki's injury. In that conversation, she confessed to having those exact same doubts and fears, and it's really neat to see it coming from Shiro at this point. And it actually makes sense to tell Sasami because she obviously can't trust the other members of Quasar because of the vindictive nature of the unit. So Sasami is the only one she can really trust with this kind of talk. Also, she kind of catches feels for Sasami, so I'm sure that influenced the decision a bit. Now I'd like to take this moment to talk about the really awesome dynamic that exists between Sasami and Shiro. They're written in such an interesting way, and I'm actually very impressed. They seem to be almost simultaneously parallels and foils of one another, and not just on a surface level. Like their actual underlying personalities reflect this, and I don't know how the fuck you'd even go about attempting something like that. Like, we've got the case of Sasami being this naive sweetheart who always wants to build everyone up, contrasted by Shiro, who is this cold, manipulative, borderline sociopath who will do any and everything to get to the top. But they have the exact same fears and stressors in their lives, and Sasami is shown to have the capacity to be devious and manipulative given the right influences. In that sense, it almost seems like Shiro is the potential endpoint to Sasami's character arc. That's all really cool to see, and I know I already said it, but I'm genuinely impressed by this dynamic and how it was pulled off so naturally. Going back to the story and fast forwarding a bit more, Sasami decides to go to the Golden Calf offices to take a look and to think things over. After all, her future with Star Nova was very uncertain, and she was basically guaranteed a good spot in another top idol group. But of course, in comes our good friend Oda, along with some of the more evil Quasar girls. Again, this ties into this whole subplot where Oda and Kamijo are both vying for control of Golden Calf, but the important bit is that Oda is a bad dude, and he decides he wants to do Oda things to Sasami. So the bad Quasar girls are doing bad things to some of the good Quasar girls, and Oda's, well, you know what Oda's looking to do. At this moment, Shiro starts having flashbacks to when she betrayed Kana and left her a blubbering mess. And she realized she couldn't do that again. So she smacks the shit out of Oda with a metal pole and goes to comfort Sasami. Ultimately, Oda wasn't down for the count and starts fucking strangling Shiro. But fortunately, at that moment, Kamijo, the producer, and security rush in to save the day. Once again, this is the conclusion to that subplot that I'm not going to go into, but I obviously have to mention this bit because it ties into our main plot. So once everything calms down, there are a few kind words spoken all around, and there's a new sense of camaraderie between Star Nova and the good eggs of Quasar. Also, Kamijo vows to fix Quasar, and while he doesn't regret fostering a competitive environment, he is ashamed that he let it get this bad. Honestly, this is one of those times when I'm kinda sad that I decided not to go into side characters because Kamijo is a fucking amazing antagonist. He is absolutely not a good dude, but throughout the story you see these small glimmers of humanity and morality in him, and when it comes down to it, he's willing to cast aside his pride for the good of Quasar. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I absolutely had to at least mention him. He is moral ambiguity done right. The story wraps up with Star Nova performing at the Idol Grand Prix. The whole kerfuffle with Oda, which also resulted in the terrible girls getting fired, was a big scandal for Quasar, so Star Nova were basically a shoo-in for the top spot. But they do something quite unprecedented by Sasami's request. The remaining girls in Quasar join them on stage and they announce a joint performance. So they put on a show as sisters, and when Star Nova wins the contest by a fucking landslide, Sasami and Shiro hoist the trophy together, and it's really cute and wholesome and shit. At the very end, Soma realized that they can't really fire the girls after a big win like that, so they agree to ride out the wave of popularity, and ultimately the girls end up having a farewell performance on their own terms, and got a good send-off, each giving a touching speech in the process. And Shiro too got her own redemption, as she's seen to be on friendly terms with none other than Kana. And so everyone lived happily ever after. I know this is like the third time I've said it so far, but this was kind of a storybook ending, but it fits. Sasami had her full arc with ups and downs and had a satisfying degree of complexity. I do wish we'd seen glimpses of her more devious nature in other routes. I mean, there are a few instances where one of the girls quips that the Lamb of Star Nova has grown horns, but it's really more of a joke and never seems to actually be related to anything truly mischievous she does. But even though she was pretty one-dimensional as a side character, she was very satisfying to see as a focal character. Her arc was believable, and I absolutely loved her interactions with Shiro and how it tied into her own story. Unlike some of the other routes, I didn't really feel that any of the plot elements were really rushed watched it all, though that may be because Sasumi's route is noticeably longer than the others. Again, I'm pretty sure this is the intended true route despite Love and Space's denial, but regardless, it's clear that Sasumi's route got a lot of love and it shows. I think it's pretty telling that the only two real complaints I have about Sasumi's route were the lack of subtlety, which was not a Sasumi-specific problem, and that one plot point about replacing the girls. Sasumi is not my favorite character, and her route was not my favorite either, but I can't deny that her route excels on a technical level, and it's a solid send-off for the visual novel as a whole. Overall, very well done. So those are the heroines of Shining Song Star Nova. I've always loved stories that give a different perspective on things, and I think this story does that in spades. From the surface level things like playing around with anime tropes, to the deeper, layered emotions and personalities the girls had within them, this story absolutely hooked me from beginning to end. Furthermore, these characters had such good chemistry with one another, and it really helped carry the story through its slow sections and added a good bit of humor and levity when needed. Whenever I finish a great book series or a visual novel, I always get a little mini depression where I'm sad to leave the world and the characters that have become a part of my life, and I absolutely get that with Shining Song Star Nova. Hell, I'm even a little sad as I'm writing this. Even though this script has been frustrating as all hell to write, I've enjoyed exploring my thoughts about these characters and this story. But in the end, when good things pass, you're still left with fond memories, and I am so very glad to have been able to experience Shining Song Star Nova one more time. Thanks for watching. This was my first go at a really in-depth video like this, so I'd love to know your thoughts on everything, and not just because it's good for the algorithm. This was like putting 7 of my normal videos together, so I'm treading new ground here. I genuinely want to know what you did and didn't like so I can improve for the future. My next video, well, probably the next couple actually, will be on gaming. I love visual novels, but I got my start with video games and I'll never abandon them. I've already got a couple ideas cooking that I'm excited to get out there. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more. I don't have an upload schedule anymore, but rest assured that I'm busting my ass to get these videos out as quickly as possible. Follow me on Twitter at AdsTweets for updates and memes, and be on the lookout for future editing streams here on YouTube. In fact, you may have seen me stream my editing sessions for this video. I'm trying to see if YouTube is better for these streams than Twitch. Let me know your thoughts down below. Well, I've already said more than enough, so once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more.